Oh, we've preempted 15 minutes on the early show for you, in full color. We guarantee you a splendid audience.
Bridge to all decks. Time for an exciting new episode of Enterprise Incidents with Scott and Steve and Ralph. I'm Scott Nance.
And I'm Steve Morrison. I've got my toga, I got my short sword, my shield. I am ready for some gladiator combat. And I'm most excited that we have, once again, Ralph Senensky joining us for this episode.
Ralph, welcome back to Enterprise Incidents. We are very excited to have you back for your third episode that you directed.
It's good to be here.
So before we get into it, and there's a lot to get into, like, how did you come to direct your third episode, Bread and Circuses?
After I did Metamorphosis, they booked me for two more. They gave me a date, and then when I arrived, they handed me Bread and Circuses.
Oh, it's that simple.
That's what, yeah. My agents would book, as all agents booked dates, and then you reported to the studio. Hopefully, you were supposed to get the script 4 days before, but that didn't always happen. On Bread and Circuses, it did.
When you got the script for Bread and Circuses, what did you think? What did you think of the screenplay that is credited to Gene Roddenberry and Gene Kuhn?
Well, whenever I saw two names like that, I wondered just how it came to be. And I'm going to find out from you today, wasn't there somebody that had written the script first, and then the two of them kept doing their versions of it?
Well, actually, that is absolutely true. And that's my cue to get into the development of this. So first of all, you're right, Ralph. The writer of the treatment for Bread and Circuses was John Newble. Now, John Newble did not get a credit on the screenplay, not even a story by credit, even though he came up with the treatment from an idea by both Gene Roddenberry and Gene Kuhn. But Newble's treatment was written on March 5th, 1967, and it was titled Bread and Circuses. So when he wrote his first draft teleplay, he changed the title to The Last Martyr. That was dated April 12th, 1967. And then he did a script polish, changing it back to Bread and Circuses. That was dated May 2nd. So it was right around this time, after he turned in his script polish, that John Newble was asked to do a revised second draft teleplay that he was asked to do for free. And he declined for personal and health problems. So he basically abandoned the project. Okay. That's when Gene Kuhn came in, and he wrote not one, not two, but three drafts, the third of which was dated August 15th. Then Gene Roddenberry did his rewrite, his second draft teleplay dated September 11th. And then he did a script polish the very next day, which was the third revised final draft teleplay. And apparently, and this is something that you'll be able to answer, Ralph, that even while this episode was being filmed, yes. Yeah, you're shaking your head, Gene Roddenberry had revisions day of. Is that true?
I will have a story about that.
Oh, yes. Wow. Can't wait to get into it. But some other interesting facts about Bread and Circuses is that in addition to being Ralph Senensky's third episode as director, this episode was filmed between September 12th and September 20th, 1967. It was shot over 7 days, so it went 1 day over schedule. It was the 44th episode to film. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. The total cost for Bread and Circuses was $192,330. And that meant that the episode went over budget by as much as $12,330 because Bread and Circuses was the first episode to be filmed under the new regime where Paramount, Gulf and Western purchased Desilu from Lucille Ball. And that caused a lot of changes. From this point forward, And Ralph, this is something I know you'll be able to speak directly to. And the other interesting thing about Bread and Circuses, while it was the 44th episode to film, it was actually the 54th episode to air. And Steve, the Bread and Circuses was the second to the last episode of season 2 to air. It was the second to the last. The very last episode to air was Assignment Earth. But for some reason, NBC pushed Bread and Circuses back to air on March 15th. Ironically, for Bread and Circuses, the Ides of March. But that's not why it was pushed back. It was actually pushed back because NBC did not appreciate how much of a satire this was to network television. And I got to say to both of you guys, like, watching this episode today with all the reality TV, it is amazing how far ahead of its time Bread and Circuses actually was. Now, when Bread and Circuses started filming on September 12th, it was actually after a 2-week break during which the cast and G. Roddenberry were making the rounds around the country on morning shows and talk shows to, get the excitement going for the season 2 premiere of Star Trek. But it was, like I said, it was the second to the last episode to air. And it was the highest rated episode of the season. And NBC did not give it a rerun. If you did not see it on its original run on March 15th, 1968, you'd have to wait until syndication to watch it again. So before we get into our deep dive with Ralph, Steve, what did you think of Bread and Circuses around the times that you saw it for the first time? I know you don't know the date, but what did you? But how has Bread and Circuses changed in your assessment over these years?
I always enjoyed it. It has one scene that I think is one of the great, most important scenes in all of Star Trek, honestly. It's a very entertaining episode. And it's funny, though, as I get older, and this has nothing to do with the episode itself, but the ideas of the episode, there's one very big choice that is made in this episode that I have continued to have bigger and bigger problems with, and that I think philosophically, idea-wise, there's just huge missed opportunities in this episode. It's not that it's not totally entertaining and enjoyable. It's that I go, oh, I feel like there was so much more here that they didn't get to. That's sort of my feeling.
Yeah, my feeling about Bread and Circuses is that when I was growing up watching this episode, I always thought it was very entertaining. I think it is a very strong episode, especially for the second season. There's a lot going on in Bread and Circuses. You have the satire about television. You have this the statement about slavery, which was something they explored in just a couple of episodes with Gangsters of Triskelion. You have a great mix of drama, humor, and heart. There's a really great scene that furthers the development, the relationship between Spock and McCoy specifically. The great production design, costume design, of course, the cinematography by Jerry Finnerman. I'm sure Ralph has got a lot to say about that. And it did start a trend of Earth parallel worlds. You have Planet of the Romans, and then we see Planet of the Gangsters, and then we're going to see Planet of the Nazis. But watching this episode for the first time in a long while to prepare for Enterprise incidents. And by the way, gentlemen, when I say that I haven't seen this episode in a long while, I mean, I haven't seen it in about 6 months, but I was really pleasantly surprised, especially watching it with such an eye for these deep dives that we've been doing, that this episode works on so many levels. And Ralph, a lot to juggle, location shooting, but you had 2 big transitions going on. First, I want to ask you about the transition from Desilu Studios, which was at that point run by Lucille Ball, to Paramount Gulf and Western, which was run by Charlie Bloodhorn. What were some of the things that you noticed when you came back to the set and started working on this episode?
Well, even before I got to the set, there was the new edict from Paramount that our schedules were going to change, that each day rather than filming until 7 o'clock, we were going to quit. We had to quit at 6:12.
Wow.
And the edict also was that the shows would no longer go into extra days, that they would be finished in 6 days.
Mm.
Now, taking away the 48 minutes a day, that's just a few minutes under a half a day. So that although the shows were still going to be scheduled in 6 days in terms of the hours, we would actually be shooting it in, they wanted it, they demanded that it be filmed in 5.5 days.
So that's what's interesting is that when I was doing my research and reading all about the transition, that especially like Robert H. Justman and Gene Roddenberry himself they were excited that a big studio was going to take over Desilu, and they thought that this would mean a bigger budget, access to more resources to really increase the look of the show, make it better. And in fact, the budget that you had to work with, like when you did Metamorphosis, the per episode budget at that time was $185,000 per episode. By the time you got to Bread and Circuses, the budget went down to about $180,000 to $182,000 per episode. I mean, it was already a struggle to do an episode on $185,000, but now, you're losing some money there. So did that create more pressure for you?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. At the time, it was just added pressure. As I looked on it once I left the show, and then with time looked back on it, I think that with Bread and Circuses, that was the beginning of the end of Star Trek, of the downward spiral. I think it started there.
One thing that sounds so strange to me is 48 minutes, taking 48 minutes out of the day is today, the day is really determined by unions. And so it wouldn't make sense, how long the day is exactly a number of hours. Did the unions have as much power in terms of how long the day was at the time?
No.
Okay. Then it makes more sense.
The only power they had was that after a certain number of hours, people in the unions would get overtime, would get gold time, but the unions had no control over how long or
they had no minimum day.
No.
Okay. Interesting. All right.
So the other thing, and we Ralph, in the last episode of Enterprise Incidents, when we covered the trouble with tribbles.
I haven't seen that one yet, but after the one yesterday, I'm not looking forward. I shouldn't say that, should I?
Well, David Gerald, who wrote the episode, joined us, and he was talking. Of course, just like you, he had so much praise for Gene L. Kuhn as producer, showrunner, screenwriter. So by this time, the other part of the transition here, a big transition, was that Gene Kuhn resigned his post as producer, showrunner at the end of August. Now, even though he had resigned at that point, he was contractually bound to stay on as producer until his contract was up at the end of the first 16 episodes of season 2. That would have brought him to a private little war. And then John Meredith Lucas took over as the showrunner for the rest of season 2. And I understand that he did show up on set on location while you were filming Bread and Circuses. But what was your reaction, Ralph, when you found out that Gene Kuhn was leaving the show?
Well, I wasn't happy. and of course, his leaving, I'm still, through the years, people have asked me why he left. And I said, because of purchase by Gulf Western, that he was just, the extra pressure was being brought on. Since then, I've heard that there was conflict between the two Genes.
That's right.
And that of course, I did not know about. But I was not happy because, with Bread and Circuses, he had been involved in all 3 of the shows that I've done, and I'll say it right now that when it came to my next one, which was Return to Tomorrow, his absence was felt. Well, not the next one, but the one after the next one.
Right.
With Return to Tomorrow, his absence was felt.
Yeah. The next two you did were Obsession and then Return to Tomorrow.
Well, the next one was Obsession, and I've said on my website that I felt his fingerprints all over that script.
Mm-hmm.
I can see that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's such a shame because, so many people have given absolutely due credit to Gene Coon for really refining the series. I mean, the two prior episodes you did, This Side of Paradise and Metamorphosis, were right at his peak, especially Metamorphosis. I mean, which not only did he write, but he was the only writer to work on that screenplay, which is just, I mean, it's such a perfect episode. Of course, you know how I feel about that episode, but I still feel like, Bread and Circuses, it's a very ambitious episode. Again, like there's so much going on. There's so much that it's saying, especially when you get to the end and there's the surprise twist, which I still think is a very effective surprise twist. I'm sure Steve's got a lot to say about that.
I 100% agree. It is a very effective surprise twist.
And that was worked on.
Yeah.
Well, when you came back, did you notice, because of all the changes, Ralph, that had gone on with the transition from Desilu to Paramount, and then Gene Coon basically putting in his notice, did you notice any difference in the way that the cast members were acting to you and with each other?
I don't think so. Not that early. As the year progressed, just the tension of that losing, that half a day for show and the pressure to get it done in the time without going over, it began to show. But it didn't surface during Bread and Circuses that I remember. Just the size of the show. The size of the show, and to do it in 6 days, except now it was going to be done in 5.5 days. That was like trying to do an epic like Spartacus in 5.5 days.
Right.
Well, there are a lot of great moments, and there was, I'm sure, a lot going on in the world while this episode was being filmed.
You are absolutely right. As you said, it was filmed between September 12th and September 20th of 1967. We spent months and months talking about one of the most important groundbreaking television shows of the 1960s. Well, there was another show that was also groundbreaking on at the same era that was far more controversial than Star Trek, and that was the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. And on September 10th, which is right before this started shooting, Pete Seeger, who had been blacklisted for 17 years, hadn't been allowed on TV, was finally being allowed back on the counterculture Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour with one agreement, that he would not sing the song Deep in the Big Muddy. And Deep in the Big Muddy was a war protest song. And they said, okay, he's not going to sing it. And he sang it which is part of why the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour became so controversial. On the same day, Frank Sinatra got into a beef with the hotel management at the Sands when they stopped his credit. Apparently, he was gambling and was too deep in debt, and he got in a fist fight with the casino operator who knocked Sinatra's 2 front teeth out, which I had never heard before.
I never heard that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On September 11th, Surveyor 6 made an unmanned soft landing in the Sea of Tranquility on the moon. The Carol Burnett show premiered, which was not a counterculture controversial show, but one of the great comedies of all time. On the 12th, Louis C.K. was born. On the 14th, there's a lot of TV news going on. Ironside premiered, starring Raymond Burr, and on the next day, Mannix premiered.
Mannix, another Desilu show.
Yep. This is
both of them.
This is all the week of, oh, wow, that's right. It's all the week of interesting TV stuff because Jim Morrison and the Doors had signed a deal to do 7 appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show. It's their first appearance. They're going to do Light My Fire. CBS insists that they change one line from Girl Wouldn't Get Much Higher to Girl Wouldn't Get Much Better, which does not rhyme with fire. And Jim Morrison said, absolutely no problem. And of course, he sang the couldn't get much higher, and those 6 subsequent appearances were canceled on the Ed Sullivan Show.
They were not invited. The door was closed on the doors.
Well, that's the way the networks were operating in those days.
Yeah. And then we're back. It's the week of TV stories because we're back on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, and The Who is performing on September 17th. And The Who, they decided, this was a band that liked to kind of break things up. So they decided they were going to have a little explosion inside the drum kit of Keith Moon. And seems like one of those things where there were a bunch of people saying, no, let's make this explosion a little bigger. No, that's not big enough. Let's make it. And they just kept adding gunpowder to this explosion. And you can watch it. It's on YouTube. It is a huge explosion. It's actually really scary. Keith Moon was injured. Pete Townshend's hearing was permanently damaged. He's deaf in one ear because of this explosion.
Wow.
And that is what has been going on in the world. Not a heavy week, but some interesting stories.
Very interesting stories. So Ralph, when you came to the set and you did your first read through, what do you remember about?
We didn't have read throughs. I keep saying that we just came on and started shooting.
Wow.
First time we sat down at a table on a show was in the 3rd year when I came back to do Is There in Truth No Beauty? And that was not for a read-through. That was for discussion, as you'll get to one of these days.
There
was no read-through. You just came in and, you started at 7:30 to have your first shot ready, lit by the time at 8 o'clock came so that you could get an early shot in a can. You usually try to find an insert to shoot first so you could shoot that so that they will know that you really got started early.
Gotcha.
There
were no read-throughs.
That's a great trick, by the way, to shoot the insert so you get a shot off real fast.
You always look for a shot that could be in, that you could say it was in the can by 8:15.
Wow, that's great. Should we get into the show?
Let's do it. If they don't move out on cue, screw them.
No doubt about it, Captain. Space debris comes from the survey vessel, the SS Beagle. Portions of the antimatter nacelles, and personal belongings. No signs of bodies whatsoever.
Then whatever destroyed the ship, the crew was able to get off safely.
By the way, I'm sure they picked the name the Beagle because that is the ship. The HMS Beagle is what Darwin was on when he went to the Galapagos. I'm sure that's why they picked that name.
The SS Beagle, a Class 4 star drive vessel with a crew of 47 under the command of R.M. Merrick.
Jim, I believe you knew him.
Yes, at the academy. He was dropped in his 5th year. He went into the merchant service.
And we're arriving at the planet. Not only is it Class M, but what they start talking about is that it's really, really, really similar to Earth.
Density 5.5, diameter 7917 at the equator, atmosphere 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen. Again, exactly like Earth.
Exactly in some ways, different in others.
So even though, Ralph, I don't know if you know this, but even though in the episode itself, the planet was never given a name, but in fan fiction, it was given a name, and the name that it was given was Magna Roma.
Oh, good.
Okay.
That's a good name for a planet like this.
Captain, both amplitude and frequency modulation being used.
Which, of course, means AM and FM radio.
I think I can pick up something visual. It's a news broadcast using a system I think they once called video.
Television was the colloquial term.
And we put it on screen, and we get our first glimpse of this planet.
Rounded up still another group of dissidents. Authorities are as yet unable to explain these fresh outbreaks of treasonable disobedience by well-treated, well-protected, intelligent slaves.
And what we see is these people being let out of what are clearly hiding places.
Now, Ralph, what do you remember about filming the scenes that we see on the view screen on the bridge?
Yeah. Well, there were the 3 location scenes where they were taking prisoners. It was 2 sequences, 3 shots, and that wasn't enough to go off at the lot. So those shots were shot on the studio. In the studio, we found doorways and a couple of doorways that we could use. And then when we went into the gladiator scenes, and they were all filmed in color, but printed in black and white.
Interesting. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Now turning to the world of sports,
which is a classic news reporter segue. And this is why I totally understand the networks going, oh, you're really making fun of the news. In fact, what I relate this episode to in a lot of ways is a movie about 7 years from now, which is Network, which is really poking fun at about the hypocrisy of news media and the falseness of it.
Also, the way that this episode has come to be re-examined because of the advent of reality TV. When we started having reality TV shows like Survivor, The Biggest Loser and all these other reality shows, but specifically shows like Survivor. I mean, when we see the newsreel footage of the gladiatorial game, that's this planet's version of Survivor, basically.
Yeah.
And
literal.
It's not literal.
Survivor.
Sure. Absolutely. And it's another way in which Star Trek was so far ahead of its time without intending to be. And it just gives this episode so much added depth to enjoy and to really do a deep dive like this and to talk about it.
I can't say that it's for sure, but I'm 99% positive that Gene Roddenberry wrote those sequences.
The news stuff?
Yes. Well, that and especially the gladiator stuff. He was the one responsible for those sequences, I'm sure, because of his own feelings about the network.
That
that's
makes
true.
a lot of sense.
the first heat involved amateurs. They're petty thieves from city prison.
As we see them fighting, and it's filmed like a sporting event, I love, Ralph, that you had the camera push in on the kill, that it's such a theatrical TV way, entertainment way of showing a thing.
In the second heat, a slightly more professional display in the spirit of our splendid past when gladiator Claudius Marcus killed the last of the barbarians, William B. Harrison, in an excellent example of...
And we static out of the thing.
Well, Spock at this point figures out that William Harrison was one of the crew members of the SS Beagle, and he's perished in these gladiatorial games.
At least there were some survivors down there.
Ready the transporter room, Mr. Spock. We're beaming down.
So one of the things that's interesting, most of our teasers end with a threat to the Enterprise. You know, with something dangerous and horrible is happening. This teaser is about an idea. It's a science fiction idea. What if Rome is in the 20th century? That is a very different kind of teaser, which I love.
It's something to think about as we go through this episode, because Steve and I, Ralph, in other episodes where the landing party is threatened and the Enterprise is threatened. In this case, the landing party, as we'll come to see, is threatened, but not the Enterprise, at least not exactly. The Enterprise is threatened, but in a different way than we've seen the Enterprise threatened in episodes like A Taste of Armageddon or The Apple or Return of the Archons. So, Ralph, filming the scenes on the bridge at this moment, because we see Kirk and Spock on the bridge of the Enterprise in the beginning at the teaser, and then we see them at the end. So did you film all that at once?
Oh, yes. And it would have been filmed later. You do the stuff with the guest stars to get rid of them and then do that.
Get rid of them.
Absolutely. Yeah. You got to shoot them out.
If you hang on to the guest stars extra days, that's just extra money. So that they would try to get all the people coming in that were not regulars, get their stuff in as few days per each one as possible.
But one of the great arts that people who don't work in film don't know about is the art of the AD and scheduling. And it is always a complicated puzzle of how do I get as little time with these guest actors, as little time on each location, make it all move as efficiently as possible, moving from set to set. It's really hard. So
when we come back to the first act, the first thing that we see is the landing party, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy materializing on the top of a hill, and there's some dialogue between them, and then we see that the episode title is Bread and Circuses.
As they're coming down the hill.
as they're coming down the hill. And then we see that it's written by Gene Roddenberry and Gene Kuhn and directed by Ralph Senensky. But the title, Bread and Circuses, actually refers to the ancient Roman emperor giving out loaves of bread at the Colosseum and pleasing the unemployed masses with gladiatorial games. The title is taken from Book 4 of Juvenal's Satires poems, specifically Satire X. The quote is, "It is all too easy to fall from power. The mob follows Fortuna and cares for nothing but bread and circuses." That's the quote. Right. So in actuality, this scene, Ralph, is day one of filming for Bread and Circuses. And you're back at Bronson Canyon, where I believe you filmed part of This Side of Paradise.
Right.
So what was that like for you to be on day one on location?
I just come off of 19 shows with Quinn Martin, where we would do 4 days of location and 3 days in the studio. But you always started on location, get that out of the way because of weather, whatever, and then you came back to the studio.
Great.
So that was normal. I'd like to go back and add a couple of things, though.
Sure.
Yeah.
Starting with that first shot, which I'm very proud of, because we were on a crane. We had to be, because we had the long shot that brought them down, but we had the closer shot of them. Well, with the crane, you were up high. With the zoom lens, we could do it. And again, with that the terrain of that part of Bronson Canyon as compared to the forestry of the other was rocky. And you just used a crane in those places just to move the camera. I mean, you could never do it with the dolly.
This atmosphere is remarkably similar to your 20th century. Moderately industrialized pollution, containing substantial amounts of carbon monoxide and partially consumed hydrocarbons.
The word was smog.
Ralph, I'm curious, what did you think of Kirk's green wraparound shirt? Because this was the first time you got to see that.
I didn't pay that much attention.
As fans, we obsess over things like that.
I know. And maybe with some of the others I did. I have to say this now. We've talked about Bill Shatner and our relationship, and it was fine, except I understand it better now because I've seen a couple of interviews that were done at that time, but in the later years when Star Trek had become big. But he was asked about the directors, and he referred to them as traffic cops.
Oh, wow. And I never knew that.
I said, oh, okay, I understand.
Uh-huh.
I understand. I mean, and that was really our relationship. I just needed to get that said.
It's so interesting, the ongoing conflicts between actors and directors. Because the opposite statement would be, for me, directors who describe actors as props, movable props. And both of those philosophies, to me, traffic cops and movable props, are totally, totally wrong.
So in the earlier versions of the story, it was Kirk beams down with McCoy and Sulu. And the reason for this is because Spock is back on the Enterprise suffering from a badly inflamed appendix. Now, in the So the reason I bring this up is because this badly inflamed appendix will have a significant meaning as the story progresses in the earlier versions of the screenplay. So just something to keep in mind, because I'm going to come back to it. But it was Kirk, McCoy, and Sulu, not Kirk, Spock, and McCoy.
That's fascinating. And then we get into an explanation of a thing that's come up a few times in various ways, and now we get a full definition.
Then the Prime Directive is in full force, Captain?
And then they say exactly what that means.
No identification of self-omission. No interference with the social development of said planet.
No references to space or the fact that there are other worlds or more advanced civilizations.
Let's go.
The thing that I think that's interesting about putting out the Prime Directive is that, they didn't know, and Ralph, you didn't know, that there were going to be people poring over these rules as really, really important things for decades to come. There was just a thing. Well, we need to explain this thing for this episode. It wasn't like a law that was going to have a dozen shows talking about it forever.
But Steve, at the same time, I feel like this up to this point, in our journey through the original series in production order, I don't think we've seen the Prime Directive sort of such a prominent part of the plot like this, in a way where they are really, really trying to stand by that Prime Directive.
Yep.
And to the point where even Scotty on the Enterprise is affected by the Prime Directive. So, but it's something that I think makes this episode more effective because of the way everything plays out, as we'll get to.
But I love
and the Prime Directive, and we will get to that big scene with the 5 of them seated, for it is talked about out in the open.
Yep. One of the things I love, by the way, once you do a big exposition dump, is that what seals it is McCoy seals it with a joke.
Once, just once, I'd like to be able to land someplace and say, "Behold, I am the Archangel Gabriel."
A, it's really funny, and B, it actually helps explain what the Prime Directive is by saying what it isn't, And just as we're talking about this and joking about it, a gunshot.
And Kirk just instinctively moves into like sort of an attack position, and he's ready for a fight. He goes to grab his phaser, and they shoot again and they say, "Don't move." So as we see a few people, sort of come up from behind rocks, they've got rifles. And as they get closer, they're wearing like gray attire. And one of them is clearly the leader of this group, Flavius Maximus. And it's played by Rhodes Reason, who on TV did shows like White Hunter. He had his own show, Bus Stop, 77 Sunset Strip, The Time Tunnel, and Here's Lucy. He was on Here's Lucy a few times. On film, he was in the movie King Kong Escapes. And in the 80s, he played Daddy Warbucks and Annie on Broadway. So, Ralph, what was your take on working with Rhodes Reason?
I thought he was wonderful.
He was great.
Just wonderful. In fact, the 3 guest stars on that, we'll get to Smithers and Logan Ramsey, all 3 of them, they were absolutely sensational.
They are great. I agree completely.
I love Flavius. I think he's a great character, and I think the actor does a great job.
Why?
We come from another province.
At which moment he sees Spock, and this is where I kind of go, wait, we've just explained the Prime Directive thing, but you've done nothing to disguise Spock at all. But we get a great joke, which is...
What do you call those? I call them ears.
He goes, "You're trying to be funny?" And Spock goes, "Never."
That's Gene Kuhn again.
Yeah, for sure.
Of course it is. Yeah.
Of course it is. Yeah.
And throughout this whole thing, we're commenting on how close this is to the 20th century Earth. And they think that these are guards, that these are Romans, that these are the bad guys.
I should kill you here. Septimus would probably be displeased. Move.
I love this shot you have, Ralph. This high angled, you got the guy with the rifle in the foreground and our people way in the background down below. It's super cinematic. This is just a great shot.
Well, and it's to establish that that it's a guarded area, that this is not just a group of people out for a picnic.
Well, and this is this thing I've said every time we've had you on the show, is how much storytelling you put into the camera position, is that the framing of the shot tells you the story rather than telling it through cuts and, POV shots and things like that. You're doing it with how you frame the shot.
Yeah, absolutely. But they are called moving pictures.
Yeah, it's true.
So Ralph, I'm curious, like as you were filming this scene, the scene where the slaves meet the Enterprise crew and then they're taking them to their hideout. Was this all shot in one day?
Yes.
Wow, that's a lot.
That and then the stuff after they leave the cave. The sun shot after they leave the cave, and then the shot of them behind the tree when the Romans take them. That was all on one day.
Yeah.
That's a lot of pages. That's a lot of dialogue for the cast to remember. It's really
and movement.
Yeah.
And movement. No,
and guns and action. Yeah. So, and then we cut to this cave, and this older man comes out of the cave, and this is Septimus.
Septimus is played by Ian Wolfe, who Trek fans especially will recognize as Mr. Ataz from the second to the last episode of season 3, the terrific episode, All Our Yesterdays. But what a phenomenal career on the big screen Ian Wolfe had. He was in 1935's version of Mutiny on the Bounty. He was in movies like Rebel Without a Cause, Witness for the Prosecution. Steve, stop me if you covered any of these on Cinephiles.
He was 71 years old.
Wow.
He came from Broadway in 1934, and he shot his last movie in 1990.
Do you remember what his last movie was?
Yes. Warren Beatty's Dick Tracy.
I got to say, this is why Ralph Senensky should be our permanent third co-host on Enterprise Incidents. You finished my job. I actually have it here. I was so excited to say that Ian Wolfe's last movie was Dick Tracy, and Ralph just like beat me to the punch. But on TV, he was in shows like The Green Hornet, The Invaders, The Partridge Family, Night Shift. He was on the short-lived TV series Barbary Coast with William Shatner. He was also in classic comedies, Steve, that I know you'll love, like All in the Family, Soap,
Sure.
Taxi Driver, and Barney Miller. Oh, wow. What an amazing career. Now, Ralph, didn't you choose Ian for this role?
No. Because I kind of knew of him, and once he came, I knew he was, that he was a veteran. I didn't realize how much until the later years, and especially with the internet and IMDb.
Wow.
And, I regret that I didn't know more as much as I know now, that I didn't know then to talk to him, although we wouldn't have had time to talk anyway. No,
right. Yeah, sure.
That's wonderful.
I love this line because it establishes so much about Flavius's character. His first line to Septimus is,
I didn't harm them, Septimus, as much as I wanted to.
Wow.
That's a great, great line. And Septimus replies,
keep always in your mind, Flavius, that our way is peace.
For which we are grateful.
For we're men of peace ourselves.
and this is the first we hear of something really important.
Are you children of the sun?
Ralph, no matter how many times I've watched this episode, whenever I hear the words, "Are you children of the sun?" I automatically think of the sun in the sky.
Yeah.
And even though this is an episode I've seen probably a couple hundred times, I'm still conditioned, especially because of a shot that we're going to see in just a few moments, that
I know
that it's like, oh, children of the sun. Like it never occurs to even Spock, who's usually, kind of ahead of the game, or as Steve has pointed out many times, Kirk is such an astute observer that it never occurs to any of them that it's not S-U-N, it's S-O-N. But that's just one of the other things that just makes this episode so satisfying.
Then let me tell you this. When I got my first script, and my big immediate concern was that the script, for me, it telegraphed that it was S-O-N. And I went to both the two genes, and most of these lines, they were written in to do exactly that. And then once they gave me Septimus's final speech when he sends him out and he talks about the sun, I said, and I knew I was going to do that shot at the sun.
Yeah, it's a good fake out. It's so effective.
I had one comment left on my website on that one who said that as many times as he's seen it, every time it gets to that shot, it's a shock.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely get to that shot because I like the way you did it too. It's very interesting.
Well, if you're speaking of worships of sorts, we represent many beliefs.
And that is that's interesting, Steve, because do you know what I thought about when that line was said?
No, I don't.
I thought of Kirk's reply to Apollo in Who Mourns for Adonai when he said, "We find the one God quite sufficient." And at first I thought to myself, did Kirk kind of contradict himself by saying that? But then I realized that believing in a God, the one God that he refers to in Whom Mourns for Adonais, and having many beliefs are two different things, because you can have beliefs that don't necessarily rely on a deity.
True. I think there's contradictions in there, but let's move on, because we'll definitely get to some of these issues. And of course, Flavius is still distrustful, and it seems in this culture that they are either Romans, which from these people's hiding out in the caves perspectives are the bad guys, or slaves.
I know killing is evil, but sometimes it's necessary.
No.
But they've located us, our hiding place. It's better to kill a few of them than all of us.
Well, he said this is such a great view into Flavius's character, and like you pointed out, Ralph, I felt Rhodes Reason just did a really great job with this episode. I mean, he just has such a charisma. He is such a presence. Yes. He's just so good, and I think that he's great with Shatner. Actually, great chemistry there.
And then Kirk does a really weird thing.
Wait. I can prove we're telling the truth. A small device.
And he goes for his communicator, and at first they pull up their rifles, because he goes, no, it's not a weapon, it's fine. And he pulls it out, and he calls up Scotty.
Scotty here, Captain. Scotty, lock in on my transmission beam. Scan us.
Scanning, sir.
Including ourselves. How many of us are there?
12, Captain.
And I love the response that Flavius and Septimus have. Septimus says,
Tell me the Empire has a device like that, Flavius, and you may kill them. Otherwise, accept them as friends.
I think the moment works. I think it's totally bizarre, particularly because we literally just had the explanation of the Prime Directive, and now you're pulling out your communicator and demonstrating this technology that's well advanced of anything on the planet, which they literally said you shouldn't do as part of the Prime Directive. And if I were Flavius and a distrustful person, and the person I have captive just demonstrated way advanced technology, I would not feel good about it. I would be more stressed about it.
But the way that Kirk said, the Enterprise is our ship at sea. It is not a spaceship in space, in the sky. So this little box could just be a walkie-talkie of sorts. And I think that's why certainly Septimus was not alarmed by the technology. If anything's going to be alarming here, it's going to be the wardrobe that they're wearing, which is completely different from anything that the Romans have. Okay. And certainly the appearance of Spock with the eyebrows and the ears. But the way that they've, especially in this case, Kirk has said, the Enterprise is our ship at sea. We come from a province. He's really trying to dial back, the presence of, the Federation and their appearance as something grounded in their world, just elsewhere in their world.
And we move inside this cave, and we're hearing Kirk's log, which, by the way, I kind of go, how is he always giving these logs? Sometimes, if he's captured by someone, he still manages to give logs, but that's okay. And we're inside the cave, and he goes over what's happening. One of the interesting things he says is, as he describes this planet, he says,
an amazing example of Hodgkin's law of parallel planet development. But on this Earth, Rome never fell.
What a great, that's the tag right there of this episode. What if Rome never fell? What a provocative idea. Like, what if Rome never fell? And here's the interesting thing. So all these years that I've watched this episode, I would say decades that I've watched this episode, I always assumed, Ralph, that the scene that we're watching right now was filmed on stage 10, but it wasn't, was it?
No.
Where was it filmed, and who shot and who lit it?
It was at Bronson Canyon.
Bronson Canyon. So you shot in actual caves at Bronson Canyon.
It was when you saw them walk into the cave there from the exterior, that they walked into that interior, and that Jerry's lighting and photography in there, because all of that was done from the floor. I mean, there was no hanging lights as you have on a soundstage. You're lit from the floor. You had to run cable to generators, and we were doing all of that and all of the exteriors. That's what in one day.
Amazing.
Well, of course it is.
And that's, and by the way, that was also, I believe, the Batcave that was used for the Batman TV series in 1966. Yeah. Wow.
Probably. I mean, it was a much used exterior location for all of Hollywood.
No, Captain. I'm sure I would have heard of the arrival of other men like you.
Perhaps you've heard, let's say, an impossible story or a rumor of men who came from the sky or from other worlds.
And again, I'm going, the Prime Directive, you literally just said you can't mention anything about other worlds or civilizations more advanced than your own. It's literally like last scene. But it's fine. And they say, and I love this,
there are no other worlds.
The stars.
Lights shining through from heaven. It is where the sun is. Blessed be the sun.
That's really amazing, because at this point, you still don't know.
I'm sure that was another line added to emphasize the sun. I want to point out that when Spock brought the magazine over before this talk about the sun with the gods' names, I'm sure that was added again to build up this whole thing to get away from sun.
Or, I mean, it's amazing. Like, even though you know the ending and know it like verbatim because you've seen it so many times, it is still such an effective establishment of the sun being the sun in the sky. I mean, you know, I was watching this episode with my girlfriend for the first time. She had no idea that the sun was the Son of God.
That was our intent.
and by the way, I think all the details, the Jupiter 8 car, the magazines, all these little things, they're great details to fill out the world that it's Roman, but B, to make it very 20th century American Earth.
The Jupiter 8, Mars toothpaste, Neptune bath salts.
Taken from the names of false gods. When I was a senator, I worshipped them too. But I heard the words of the sun. I became a brother. For that, they made me a slave.
I love the fact that Septimus was a senator. I think that it says so much about his character. And Kirk is basically asking for help because we need to go back into the city and find these friends of ours that we've lost.
Perhaps you know his name. Merrick, Captain Merrick.
And everyone turns around. They all stand up and Septimus says, Mericus? And Kirk is like, okay, we're getting closer to the root of the problem here. Clearly, Merrick is there and everyone knows who he is, which is a big problem for the Prime Directive.
Americus is first citizen. Butcher.
The word butcher.
It's key.
If he is your friend, you are no friends of ours.
Which means, by the way, that he went from prisoner to really important guy really, really quick, which I never quite, it's a part of the story that doesn't quite ring right to me.
Well, what makes you think that Merrick was a prisoner?
Well, all of his people were prisoners and were being put to death in the arena.
But Merrick was not. I never assumed for a second that Merrick was a prisoner, because when he meets the proconsul, when he meets the proconsul, he works out a deal with the proconsul where he orders the rest of his men while he becomes first citizen. I never thought for a minute that he was a prisoner.
No, you're right. I misspoke. I don't mean that he was a prisoner. I merely mean that he went pretty high in the power of Rome right away.
As Kirk could have if he had wanted to stay on there.
Oh, that's a good point.
That's a great point. And that is exactly why Merrick admires Kirk, because Kirk is going to be in the same position that Merrick was in, but each of those men handled it differently. And that goes back to what we were established about Merrick, that he failed the psychosimulator test. We'll get to that.
Well, that literally is where we are right now, because Kirk asked for their help to get them into the city, and they go away to decide whether or not they're going to help Kirk. And that is when Spock asks,
Curious, Captain. Were you told why Merrick was dropped from the Space Academy?
He failed his psychosimulator test. All it takes is a split second of indecision. Hardly the type to become a political strongman.
And it makes me wonder, like, I don't think this was the Kobayashi Maru. I don't think that's the test that he failed. But it does make me wonder, who was Merrick in Starfleet Academy?
Odd that these people should worship the sun. Why, Doctor? Because, my dear Mr. Spock, it is illogical. Rome had no sun worshippers. Why should they parallel Rome in every way except one?
What I understand is, I don't know enough about Roman history, but apparently they did have sun worshippers. But for the sake of the episode, I guess it still works.
The slaves have decided they are going to help them, and Flavius is going to guide them. And then we hear, and this is the shot we've been talking about for a while, we hear Septimus say,
"May the blessings of the sun be upon you."
And there's that dissolve to this.
It's a cut. Yeah, it's a cut.
But it's a great cut because it's a shot of the sun blazing in the sky and the camera looking up as Flavius and then Kirk and McCoy and they pass by. It's such a great shot. It's one of the shots that has always stood. And tell us about setting up that shot, Ralph.
You just aimed at the sun and walked people in front of the camera.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me, more interesting actually than the shot, is where the cut is, because the cut is at a weird place in the middle of the line. It's halfway in the middle of Septimus's line, which really highlights the word sun, because you cut right there. But
that's done in the editing room. In other words, we shot the sequence, and I'm sure that there was more time on the sun before the body came through, and there was more time, maybe more bodies came through, and then you trim it to what you want in the editing room.
Well, and that's why I think the editor made a brilliant choice, because cutting it at that moment makes me focus even more on the sun as the sun in the sky. That storytelling is really strong to me.
Yeah, absolutely it is.
Are you a slave, Flavius?
You are barbarians indeed. Not to know of Flavius Maximus.
Flavius Maximus, like we're so proud that he was Flavius Maximus.
Well, and there's another great gladiator named Maximus that comes along about 30 years later with Russell Crowe.
Russell Crowe. Are you not entertained?
and what he hears is that he was a big, most successful gladiator in the province, and then he heard the words of the sun.
The words of peace and freedom. It wasn't easy for me to believe. I was trained to fight, but the words are true.
And Kirk starts to ask some questions about this because this is really interesting. And then automatic weapons.
The automatic weapons come from Danish Madsen M50 submachine guns. These are Roman cops. How do you set up that shot? So you have Kirk and Spock and McCoy and Flavius behind the trees. And then you have the rounds go off and you see the trees, obviously hit, quote unquote, by the guns.
I don't know how they did that, really, to see stuff coming off of the tree without hurting. I don't know. That's the special effects guys who just knew what they were doing.
Clearly they know what they were doing.
But with the four of them, it did make birds sting instead of just having them in a circle with individual close-ups.
It's also a shocking moment, like when you're watching the episode, it shocks you. You like, whoa.
I don't think we've had automatic weapon fire in Star Trek. Sulu had the handgun in Shore Leave. He had a revolver. Other than that, I think this is the first time we've heard gunfire like this. We had the strafing runs from the airplanes in Shore Leave, because it's a shocking moment. And
it sure is.
And it seems like these are just the patrols that go around to capture runaway slaves.
4 fleeing fish, a fine haul.
And then he sees Flavius
Maximus,
who attacks and immediately gets knocked down. Then he sees Spock.
Oh, not slave. Barbarians. It's been a long time since I've watched barbarians die in the arena.
Which actually, it was like yesterday, because we just saw a barbarian die in the arena on the bridge when they were watching TV. He said the last of the barbarians, William Harrison, is dying. But it doesn't matter. And that brings us to the end of Act 1.
Yeah, but let's go back to that officer, Bill Bramley, who had played Officer Krupke on Broadway.
Oh.
And in the movie. And he was a favorite of mine in 1963. I used him in A Breaking Point. I used him from then on in 2 different suspense theaters, in 3 different FBIs. He was a sensational actor.
So Officer Krupke in the stage and obviously the film version of West Side Story.
Yes.
See, this is why, Ralph, our third host. This
Well,
is great.
Bill Bramley was a favorite, and unfortunately, and I just found this out the other day when I was looking on IMDb. He died very early. I think he died in his 50s.
Oh. Well, as we come back into Act Two, I love the shot that really establishes what Rome would have looked like in the 20th century. You have the stock footage while Kirk is giving his captain's log and says, "Oh, only on this world, Rome never fell," and the establishing shots to sort of set up a 20th century Rome were actually the Great Dome at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the Palace of the Legion of Honor in Paris. How did you find this stock footage?
That's the editing department. They just find them.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing.
Find them. They just find they know.
So when we see the establishing shots using the stock footage of what Rome would have looked like in the 20th century, you're hearing Kirk talk about the Roman Empire of the 20th century and the music cue that is being used, because all of the music that was used in Bread and Circuses was stock music. They did not record a new score for Bread and Circuses, but the music cue that is used is the music cue that was recorded for Mirror, Mirror when we were establishing the Empire in the Mirror universe. And now we're using that music to establish the Empire on this planet.
Mm-hmm. And we cut to, we're in a dungeon, and they carry Flavius in, and Kirk goes in.
Tell Merrick I'd like to see him.
And he's like, "What? I'm not going to go call the president and say that you want to see him. That's nuts."
Tell him it's Jim Kirk. Perhaps a friend.
Perhaps?
Well, if I am a friend, and you don't tell him, do you really want to risk that?
Boy, does he know how to manipulate the situation.
Great Kirk moment.
Great Kirk moment.
It's later on, and McCoy is treating Flavius, and we hear...
But if there have been slaves for over 2,000 years, hasn't there always been discontent runaways?
Long ago, there were rebellions, but they were suppressed.
Which immediately makes my brain go to Spartacus.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And with each century, the slaves acquired more rights under the law. They received rights to medicine, the right to government payments in their old age. And they slowly learned to be content.
The institutionalization of slavery within the society in a post-New Deal world, like that is such a kind of fascinating science fiction idea of how a modern 20th century world and bureaucracy would incorporate and institutionalize slavery. That's sort of fascinating. Not anything we spent a lot of time on, but.
And this is also, these are not slaves like were read, from the 1800s. These are not black slaves; these are white slaves. But it's still slavery, and it is such a one of the great layers of this episode is that it tackles so much effectively like this.
Can I get a word in here too?
Yes, please do.
The photography in the cell. I mean, those were just gray walls, and Jerry with his coloring of the walls. I mean, there's a shot of Spock, a reverse shot with the others at the other end of the cell, where his wall is red. He has again brought drama into what was really a drab setting.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, Finnerman is a genius.
That's a great point. And as we're talking about this idea of institutionalized slavery, McCoy says,
quite logical, I'd say, Mr. Spock. Just as it's logical that 20th century Rome would use television to show its gladiator contest, or name a new car the Jupiter 8.
I love Spock's reply here.
Doctor, if I were able to show emotion, your new infatuation with that term would begin to annoy me.
And I love that Flavius has a reaction to that. Flavius turns to Kirk and says, are they enemies?
They don't know.
I'm not sure they're sure.
What's funny to me, by the way, is if you take the time to say that if I had emotions, this would annoy me, you're saying this annoys me.
Yeah, exactly. You are.
Again, Gene Kuhn.
So that's got to be Gene Kuhn for sure.
Kirk asks about when the slaves began to worship the sun.
Long ago. Perhaps as long ago as the beginning of the empire.
Which, in terms of our world history, is exactly right in terms of when Jesus arrived and when the Empire began. They are almost exactly the same time.
The message of the sun that all men are brothers was kept from us. Perhaps I'm a fool to believe it. It does often seem that man must fight to live.
So right now, Flavius is talking with Kirk, and he says the line, "Man must fight to live." Flavius is literally speaking Kirk's language, because what does Kirk say in the episode, Ralph, that you directed first, This Side of Paradise? I'll tell you what he said. Maybe we weren't meant for paradise.
Maybe we were meant to fight our way through, struggle, claw our way up, scratch for every inch of the way.
And that is what Flavius is saying, that man must fight to live. So you're having this connection between Flavius and Kirk, because here is Flavius on this planet, and he's saying basically the same thing that Kirk has said literally in This Side of Paradise.
It's part of what makes this episode weird to me, because I'm so glad you brought that up. I think that's a great point.
You go on believing it, Flavius. All men are brothers.
There's a weird thing where the Enterprise, and this is what we'll get to at the end, associates with this message, all men are brothers, total peace, the message of the sun. And yet what you just pointed out is in a lot of ways, Kirk actually associates with what is believed to be wrong in that philosophy, which is what Flavius says, all men must fight to live. There's weird stuff in here that isn't dealt with a lot, I think.
Well, at the same time that they're saying that all men are brothers, I think you can have it. I think you can support both reasonings, that all men are brothers, but man must fight to live. Because first of all, you're talking about an episode that was filmed in September of 1967. So there were two things happening while this episode was being filmed. Certainly two things that would have affected the writing or the rewriting by both Gene Roddenberry and Gene Kuhn. One, of course, is that the flower power from the Summer of Love was still in the air, because it had only been a couple months since, Sgt. Pepper and Haight-Ashbury. But the other thing was that the civil rights movement was well underway, and that is man fighting to live. And all men are brothers. That was the purpose of the fight, was to support that all men are brothers. You're fighting so you don't have to fight. So it's all interconnected. At least that's the way I see it.
And that they add, and it's still the way it's happening today.
100% yes. I agree completely.
Same thing.
Flavius, your friends are waiting for you. You've already been matched for the morning games.
Which means that Flavius is going to have to be a gladiator again.
I will not fight. I am a brother of the sun.
Put a sword in your hand and you'll fight. I know you, Flavius. You're as peaceful as a bull.
And they take him away.
The interesting thing about that is that Flavius was a fighter. He was a great gladiator until he heard the words of the sun. And those words spoke to him. He liked what he heard. But instinctively, he is still a fighter. He wants to believe the words of the sun. And this is why I feel like Rhodes Reason really gave a fully realized and dynamic performance. Because you see he is a fighter. Clearly he is. We're going to see him do that a couple of times. But you see that he really wants to believe the words of the sun. And as he is taken off, I was thinking about something that, Steve, you pointed out many times throughout our journey on Enterprise Incidents. Kirk says,
3 against 3. We may never have a better chance.
And this is where I thought of Kirk, the observer.
Mm-hmm.
He picked that up mighty fast. And that is something I never noticed before until, Steve, you mentioned many times and pointed out how great Kirk is as the observer.
And it's also him being the person of action. Like, we don't wait, attack now. And we go right. It's so funny at this point, McCoy, they're so good at knowing what Kirk's tricks are, because he says,
I doubt if he'll get very far. He feels ill.
I do.
So first of all, the fake out You're faking that one person is sick to get out of the situation is something that we're going to see them use again, especially in an episode like By Any Other Name, where Spock fakes being sick.
And they start walking out carrying McCoy, and of course he does double over, and now we're into a fight. And they do pretty well. And then we hear,
"Well done, Jim."
And you see Kirk's reaction in shock. We see clearly this is Merrick. This has to be Merrick. Now, just to be clear, when Kirk says he knew Merrick, he never met him. Like, this is the first time he's actually meeting, because Merrick says, "Yes, it's me." Now, Merrick is part of a group of characters we've seen in Star Trek, ship commanders who lost their way. You have a Decker who lost his way and his ship and his crew, rather, big time in the Doomsday Machine. And you also have Captain Ron Tracy, who, like Merrick, blatantly disregarded the Prime Directive in the Omega Glory. But Merrick is played by William Smithers, who on film was seen in movies like Papillon and Death Sport. On TV, he was on Peyton Place, The Avengers, Mission Impossible, The Mod Squad, and he had a recurring role as Jeremy Wendell on the 80s TV show Dallas.
You said something, and I want to just clarify. Did you say that you thought that Kirk had never seen Merrick before?
No, Kirk said, in the teaser, Spock said, "Jim, I believe you knew him," but Kirk didn't know him personally. He knew of him, but I think seems to me that they never met face to face until this moment.
Oh, I always thought they met face to face. I always assumed that he did know him. They were in the academy together, and this guy failed out in the last year.
Well, they were in the academy, but not necessarily at the same time.
It's certainly possible that they didn't know each other, but I always assumed they did.
Because he even says, "Yes, it's me." I mean, why would he say that if they had already met previously? But also, we also in the same shot are going to meet for the first time Proconsul Claudius Marcus, played by Logan Ramsey. And I think both of these guys are absolutely fantastic. Now, Logan Ramsey was in movies like Walking Tall, Any Which Way You Can, Fat Man and Little Boy, and Scrooged on TV. He was in For the People, which was the TV series that William Shatner was in right before he got Star Trek, Mannix, Mission Impossible, Mork and Mindy, Battlestar Galactica, Quincy, and Knight Rider. And Ralph, you had said earlier in our conversation that you thought all three of these actors, Rhodes Reason, William Smithers, and Logan Ramsey, were all terrific, and they are. Yeah. But tell us a little about William Smithers first.
Well, I didn't know much personally about him. Again, I had not worked with him before. I just knew the name. Joe D'Agesta cast him, and we came on the set, and he just was great to work with. I didn't know him. I knew Merrick.
Oh, how about you mean Logan Ramsey?
And Logan Ramsey, I thought he was very much like Charles Lawton back at Sign of the Cross.
Yeah, I could totally see that.
He's a great villain in this episode, I have to say.
Oh, it's a wonderful performance.
And a couple of interesting things happens. The first thing is that Merrick says, and I think this is a key line,
I'm afraid it isn't that easy. They've been handling slaves here for 2,000 years.
Which means that your little clever pretend to be sick thing, these guys have seen it before. That's the first thing. That's the first thing. And then the other thing is this moment between Mericus and Kirk.
There's lots to talk about.
And then there's a pause, and looking very strongly at Kirk, Merrick says,
"Lots to explain."
I agree.
Don't judge me before you know the facts.
That's a key line. Don't judge me before you know the facts. And you know what? Even when we hear the facts, we're going to judge you.
Oh, shit.
And then the other really important piece of information, because we've established the Prime Directive and what the rules are, which was really important in Act 1, because now we hear...
Come on, we can talk freely here. The Proconsul knows who and what we are.
Now, what's interesting is that in earlier outlines, the Federation ship survivor was not a human named Merrick. It was, and I never knew this, a Vulcan named Jerath. So the reason this was taken out was it would not make sense because, like Steve pointed out early in this conversation, it would have been impossible to hide an alien appearance like this from like a big government like the one that we have here.
It's a high angle as we enter into these very luxurious quarters.
Well, a celebration. A meeting of old friends.
Which is why I think they knew each other. They had to know each other.
So this is a Vulcan. Interesting. From what I've heard, I wish I had 50 of you for the arena.
Which, from what we see, would probably be a pretty good show if you could get him to fight.
Yeah. Well, we've seen Spock fight already. We know he's a good fighter.
This other is your ship surgeon? McCoy. It's a pity we can't let him loose in our hospitals. Our level of medicine would improve immeasurably, I'm sure.
Which is all evidence that this guy knows all about them.
And instead of using that to the advantage of their society, all he wants is fighters in the ring on the games for big ratings.
We asked Merrick what happened, and we find out there was meteor damage. They beamed down, and that he met this gentleman.
He convinced me it would be unfair to this world to carry word of their existence elsewhere.
Contamination. Can't reset.
And then for the first time, Kirk asks,
what happened to your crew?
Does not get an answer.
Did they voluntarily come ashore?
Yeah, he catches himself and says, come ashore. So, Ralph, while you were filming the scene with William Shatner and Logan Ramsey and William Smithers, these actors are they're really great together. It's a powerful scene. Did anything stick out at you while you were filming this moment?
No, it's just because I had the five in the circle around the table.
Mm-hmm.
And what I do not like would be to shoot a master in 5 close-ups.
Right.
So you break it up, and I had cross shoulders with Kirk and Merik. I have cross angles with Spock and Doc. And then I had close-ups of each of them. But to break it up so that it doesn't, the other just becomes boring.
The feature I made, I had a lot of conversation with 6 people, and I foolishly did too much of singles, and it was boring. And to point out something that I won't go into technically what it means, but there's this thing called the 180-degree rule, or the line, which shows which directions people are looking. And for a scene like this, it's really hard. It takes a lot of mental figuring out to make sure you're not breaking the rules. And of course, Ralph, you did it all beautifully.
Let me tell you something. I know about the 180 degree. I never used it. I just visualized the matching shots.
It just clicked in your head without a problem.
It just did. I think one time in 26 years, I woke up 4 o'clock in the morning, and I said yesterday, you mismatched.
Having taught a lot of students in film school, this is a really hard concept for people to get. So the fact that it comes naturally, and I have a guess of why, because you have a theater background, and thinking in terms of a proscenium stage is one way to really help you understand where the camera should be in terms of the line.
Absolutely.
But I won't go into technically what all that stuff means. If people want to know, we can explain it another time, where we talk about it on the Cinephiles a lot. Okay. I lost my place.
Oh, aren't you doing this by rote, but from memory?
I wish.
This is an ordered world, Jim. A conservative world based on time-honored Roman strengths and virtues.
And again, Kirk asks,
what happened to your crew?
The fact that Merrick has not answered, we are already establishing that he is ashamed at what he did, that he knows he did the wrong thing, and that he turned his back on his oath, on his crew, and he is a weak person. He is a weak person, and we are going to see just how weak he is from this point forward.
And again, in trying to avoid the question, he keeps talking about this civilization. He says,
there's been no war here for over 400 years, Jim. Could, let's say, your land of that same era make that same boast? I think you can see why they don't want to have their stability contaminated by dangerous ideas of other ways and other places.
By the way, I love that if you watch the Pro-Council, he's totally enjoying this conversation.
Oh, yes.
I think he's a great
he sure
character.
is.
Yeah.
And but the thing that's interesting is that Spock understands the rationale.
Oh, yeah.
And
logic.
Yeah, it's logic. This is another way in which Spock's character is further developed, that he understands even if he doesn't approve.
Right.
Because remember, Steve, back in A Taste of Armageddon, when Anon 7 was explaining the entire deal that they have with Vendikar and the whole thing with the fusion bombs and whatever, and Spock says, "I do not approve. I understand." And then just recently in the Apple, there was a big conversation between Spock and McCoy, where McCoy is completely against what's happening to the Valiants with Vol, where Spock is saying, "Look, Doc, these people are healthy and they're happy." So Spock understands the rationale, but he obviously, he does not approve of it.
Well, I think what's so great about it, and I'm so glad you pointed it out, Scott, is that what Spock saying this does is, I hope, the idea is to shake up the blind obedience to whatever system you got born into. So that, because our naturalies go like, well, the way we do things must be right, without examining it. And by Spock saying, no, I understand this, or let's think about this, is forcing you to go, well, wait, are there other ways to approach this? And even with some that we might really not like, still go, oh, I see the logic here. And I think, again, Spock's arguments are very strong because McCoy says,
next he'll be telling us he prefers it over Earth history. They do seem to have escaped the carnage of your first 3 world wars, Doctor.
They have slavery, gladiatorial games, despotism.
Situations quite familiar to the 6 million who died in your First World War, the 11 million who died in your second, the 37 million who died in your third. Shall I go on?
And before we go on, I just have to correct Mr. Spock here.
I have it too. Go ahead. I wrote
Oh my God, this is hilarious. So Spock says that 6 million died in World War I, when in actuality, between 18 to 23 million died in World War I. Now that's not just soldiers, that's civilians. Spock says 11 million died in World War II.
That's way
when
low.
in fact, that's way low. Between 60 to 80 million died. Of course, that is not just civilians and soldiers, but also part of the Holocaust. So Spock said that 37 million died in World War III. That is really, really low. And the company, the organization that was used by the producers of Star Trek to ensure accuracy was called DeForest Research. And DeForest Research suggested that the number of people who, quote unquote, died in World War III be changed from 37 million to 260 million. But for whatever reason, Gene Kuhn ignored the advice of DeForest Research and kept the numbers for World Wars I, II, and III, what they were, the ones that Spock said. But it is just the back and forth between Spock and McCoy. It's just such a great dynamic that you have these completely opposite ends of the extreme arguing their points and making very strong points in favor of each way.
But I'm glad that what you've done is that you've now at least put the blame not on Spock, but on Gene Kuhn.
That's a good point. And I love that, the proconsul then turns this question on to Kirk, and I love Kirk's very diplomatic and specifically directed response.
And you, Captain, which world do you prefer? My world, proconsul, is my vessel, my oath, my crew. What happened to your vessel? You've explained. What happened to your oath is obvious.
And that leads to this question he's been asking this whole time.
And as for my men, those that were able to adapt to this world are still alive. Those who couldn't adapt are dead. That's the way it is with life everywhere, isn't it?
That's a lot of a statement and a lot of a rationalization Merrick just made.
And this is another example of just, the fact that Merrick wound up commanding a crew of 47. He probably shouldn't have even gotten that far. He shouldn't have been command at all on a deep space vessel if he could be so easily swayed and influenced to send his men to certain death.
You sent your own men into the arena?
Just as I did, Jim, you're going to order your own people ashore.
I think Merrick is a fantastic character. I think he is a really, really well-constructed character. And I love how many rationalizations he's had to build in. And this latest one is you're going to do the same. No matter all your starship thing and that you succeed, I got kicked out of the academy on a technicality. You're no different from me. You're going to do the same. That's how he's constructed the world.
Wishful thinking.
Yes.
You must know that's impossible. Starfleet regulations are designed
to circumvent any such order. There may be over 400 men on your ship, Captain, but they can be brought down if it's handled properly.
He has the advantage of he's had Merik to study. He knows all about how all of this stuff works.
Your communicator, Captain Kirk. Now, do save us all a lot of unnecessary trouble and issue the appropriate orders.
All right, first of all, there it is, that Kirk is being told his crew is to beam down. And when Merrick says to him,
they're going to be arriving soon anyway, Jim. A recon party, then a rescue party, then another rescue party. I had less men. It added up the same.
You see that Merrick he's not coming from a place of strength. He's almost like he's coming from a place of desperation to force Kirk to have his crew beam down. The proconsul's menace is far more effective than Merrick's. I'm not scared of Merrick. I'm scared of the proconsul.
Well, and Merrick is defensive.
Right.
He's saying that Kirk will do this to prove that he was right in doing it.
Exactly.
I think there have been several great supporting characters in the course of Star Trek. And I think Merik is another one who has a fully realized journey through this episode. By the way, I also think that there's a huge difference between the Beagle and the Enterprise. The Beagle was damaged in a small ship. Like, there is no way there's no circumstances at all ever that the entire Enterprise crew would beam down to this planet. That doesn't make sense. But that's not a criticism of the show. I just don't think. I think the proconsul and Merik are wrong. That won't happen.
Merik even says that Kirk. He says this later, that Kirk commands not a spaceship but a starship,
right?
A very special vessel.
Do you really believe I can be made to order my own people down? I believe this, Captain, that you would do almost anything, rather than see these two dear friends put slowly to death.
And he has the communicator, and McCoy says, Jim. And I love that Kirk gives him a little look.
Kirk Enterprise.
Bridge. Scott here.
Scotty, if you have a fix.
And just as he says that, the Roman guards come in with their machine guns drawn, and they are standing on each side of Kirk, ready to basically blow his head off.
Yes, and that's the way the script read. And the next cut is to the proconsul with his hand under the table that he has summoned them.
What I think is so great about this setup is it's always one of the mistakes people make is they want to set up how great their hero is. And frequently what you want to set up is how great your villain is that what this shows is that the proconsul is a step ahead. Yeah. That's really key.
And the other thing so there's a lot going on in the scene. I mean, clearly there's a lot going on. Kirk is being told to
it was a long scene.
How did the shooting of that scene go? Did it because these actors are terrific?
Yeah. Well, I shot that scene, and then there were two more scenes later with Kirk and the slave girl.
Drusilla, yeah.
And that was the day's work. But I mean, it was a long, long scene with a lot of coverage.
The amazing thing is that I certainly picked up watching this episode with this, fresh set of eyes, is how cool and how confident Kirk is.
Oh, yeah.
He does not lose his cool. I feel like Merrick is kind of losing his cool the way he's telling Kirk to, beam your crew down. That they're going to keep sending other rescue parties. You might as well just beam them down. And Kirk, when he opens his communicator, you're right, Steve. He gives McCoy
it's cool.
Cool smile.
Don't worry. Yeah. And now we have this pause. He's halfway through his message to Scotty, and now we're going to have a little conversation.
Captain, what are you going to order your men to do? If I brought down 100 of them armed with phasers...
And proconsul has an answer for this.
You could probably defeat the combined armies of our entire empire. And violate your oath regarding non-interference with other societies. I believe you all swear you'd die before you'd violate that directive. Am I right?
Steve, am I right that maybe you thought of another episode at this moment?
I thought of a bunch of episodes, but maybe the Apple would be one in specific.
I was thinking more of A Taste of Armageddon.
Absolutely. 100%.
Because when the proconsul says your vessel could lay waste to the entire surface of the world, which is what Kirk threatened to do when he ordered General Order 24 in A Taste of Armageddon. Now, that made me think of something else that I've never thought about before, because I haven't gone through the episodes in the way that we've been going through them on Enterprise incidents. In A Taste of Armageddon, the Enterprise is threatened. In Return of the Archons, the Enterprise is threatened. In The Apple, the Enterprise is threatened. But it's a little different here in Bread and Circuses. The Enterprise is not threatened, not exactly. There is a threat to the Enterprise, but it's different than those other episodes. Because in those other episodes, Eminiar 7 and Val and Landru were attacking the Enterprise directly. In Bread and Circuses, the threat to the Enterprise comes through Captain Kirk. It's through him that the proconsul is threatening the Enterprise. It's different from those other episodes.
What I would say is that it's Kirk and Spock and McCoy who are being threatened.
Right. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
They're being used to leverage the Enterprise. I don't think the Enterprise, I agree with you. The Enterprise is never specifically under threat.
It's a very different way in which the quote unquote Enterprise crew is threatened, and they are threatened, but the proconsul needs Kirk to order the crew down, and Kirk will not let that happen.
The other thing I love is that is the proconsul is going over what he knows about the Prime Directive. Spock confirms it by saying, "Quite correct." And I think this episode does, and there's a reason for it, does such a great job of advancing and focusing on the McCoy-Spock conflict.
Must you always be so blasted honest?
But the way he slams his fist down on the chair and goes, must you be so blasted honest? DeForest Kelley is terrific in this episode.
Well, they always are.
Again, and I love that Merrick understands he's commanded a spaceship, and he says,
Jim, you've already started a message. Your engineer is waiting. What are you going to do?
And there are long looks, and there's a pause, and Kirk, in his casual way, gets back on and says,
"Sorry to keep you waiting.
We were becoming concerned, Captain. You were a bit overdue.
Order your officers to come down. Condition green, all's well, Kirk out."
And then he slams the communicator shut. The proconsul is furious. And this is a great scene. There's no way he's going to beam his people down. No way.
And Merrick says, and I think this is a critical and important line, he says,
that was stupid, Jim.
This is not an academy training test. This is for real. They're taking you to die.
Ouch. Wow.
And the reason I think it's important is, why is Merrick not the captain of a starship? Because he failed an academy training test. I know it seems like a small deal, but what's so interesting to me is that Merrick didn't get that the whole point of the training test was someday you might have to do this for real. And so what Kirk goes like, yeah, I know it's real. That's why I passed all those tests, because I played them as if they were real. And Merrick didn't get that, no, this is actually what it's all about, is being willing to die for the Prime Directive, for what was right, and he wasn't willing to do it. That's the moment.
And what all of this is also proving is that Merrick is, his whole attitude, he's subject to the proconsul.
Right.
And it will be a scene not too far from here where the proconsul sends him out because he's not man enough to listen to the conversation between two men. So his whole thing is that he is basically a weaker man.
Absolutely, he is.
And at this point, he's fighting for his own survival.
And, not only is Merrick a weaker man, but the proconsul does not respect him.
Of course, absolutely.
But he respects Kirk.
Which Merrick knows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he knows it. Exactly.
Well, I think, his whole way of surviving without, honor and courage is to believe to some degree that honor and courage are myths, that they're not real, and that anyone who follows that must be a fool, which is what Kirk, he's like, Kirk, you must be a fool. This isn't an academy training test. This is really your life. And they march Kirk, Spock, and McCoy out, And I have a question for you, Ralph, is because the camera is on them, and then the camera tilts down to the brazier, to the fire, and then it cuts to the proconsul for the last moment.
I wish they hadn't cut.
That was my question. My assumption was that was what you wanted to be the end of the act.
Yes. And later, I've recently read an interview by the film editor. His feeling was that if he stated that that you always cut to a reaction shot,
right?
And that's what he did there, and he did it even worse in another coming episode.
Oh, I can't wait, because it was so clear to me that you had set that up to be the final shot of the act. Yeah. And that is, of course, the end of Act 2. In Act 3, we start finally back up on the Enterprise with Scotty, who explains what Condition Green is.
Captain Kirk and his landing party have checked in, but they have used the code term Condition Green, which means they're in trouble. But it also prohibits my taking any action.
And he calls up Chekhov and he says,
pinpoint power source locations, type power load factors, and how much our beams will have to pull to overload them.
That may take some time.
Let it take time, lad.
I think Scotty's a great leader.
So Scotty was told Condition Green prohibits him from taking action. And what is he doing? He's taking action.
Absolutely.
Because that is Scotty. That is the Scotty who went back to Capella 4 in Friday's Child after disregarding what turned out to be a fake distress call from a Federation starship. Scotty is exactly the person you want in charge of the Enterprise when Kirk and Spock are not there. Although no shade to Sulu. Sulu was good in Arena, but this is and Errand of Mercy. But clearly, Scotty is, and just the way Scotty is controlling the situation. The way Jimmy Doohan plays it is so perfectly, because Scotty is leaning into his engineering skills to take action.
That's a good point.
I have a question.
Yes.
I wonder if Kirk doesn't realize this.
By giving him the Condition Green.
That's the way his way of finishing the conversation. Now, Scotty knows that's don't take any action, but Kirk also knows that Scotty's going to think that.
He knows that Scotty's going to do something. He's just basically saying, if you're going to do anything, don't make it so obvious.
Yes.
Which is exactly what he does.
Absolutely.
I think that's totally true. Ralph, I'm very curious about how you approach these next sequences, because what we're going to see is we're watching a TV show about making a TV show. And so this must have been really interesting for you and how you approached it. We're on the set where these sporting events take place, and we see the cameras and we see the announcers. And now my guess was this just on the regular set? Were we looking at the floor of the soundstage here?
Stage 10?
Well, not only, yes, we were. And don't forget, I spent 4 years in live television doing that.
Oh, wow. That's right. So you must have been this must have been real fun for you to shoot.
That was easy to do. The only thing is that our announcers were always in an announce booth, and here they just had them on a platform looking down.
Which doesn't make any sense.
The cameras with the people, with the cameramen moving them around. I mean, I was around that for 4 years.
And does that voice sound familiar to you, Steve?
It does not. Who is it?
The voice of the announcer who we see actually is Bart LaRue, who is saying, before your sun burned hot in space and before your race was born. He's the voice of the Guardian of Forever. We're going to see Bart LaRue in person again in the upcoming episode Patterns of Force. He was the voice of one of the providers in Gamesters of Triskelion. He was the voice of Yarnik in The Savage Curtain. And depending on who you talk to, he was the voice of Troian's father in The Squire of Gothos, which was either Bart LaRue or James Doohan, depending on what you read. Yeah. I know when we did our deep dive of The Squire of Gothos, I said that the voice of Troian's father was James Doohan, but other reports say that it was in fact Bart LaRue. And he's just got that great voice for a voiceover.
And I love that they just align like...
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Live and direct from City Arena and in color.
That stuff so locks it into, this is just showbiz. This is TV, And we hear that we're going to a tape commercial for 40 seconds. And that's when Kirk and Merik and the proconsul enter. Kirk is handcuffed. They go up to sit down in the stands. And Shatner does a really good job, I think, of showing how stressed he is when people aren't looking, and then putting on the swagger and the confidence when he needs to, when the proconsul is paying attention to him.
He's great at that. I mean, remember just when we were talking about the deadly years, that when he was in the command chair after he started to age, he tried to show that he still had, the ability to do that. And then when no one is looking, he would look scared. Shatner was great and stuff like that.
In come McCoy and Spock. They're holding short swords and shields.
And first tonight, ladies and gentlemen, a surprise extra. In the far corner, a pair of highly aggressive barbarians. Strong, intelligent, with strange ways, and I'm sure full of a lot of surprises.
I love announcer speak. You know what I mean? Like just we are trying to make you excited in this show, except for the fact that this show is going to involve people getting killed on camera. But it's just showbiz.
Well, one thing that's interesting about the earlier outline of this episode is that instead of Spock and McCoy fighting two other gladiators in earlier versions, it was supposed to be Spock fighting Kirk.
Oh.
So, Steve, what does that sound like?
Mock time.
Exactly. And that's why Dorothy Fontana said, hang on a second. So she pointed out the similarities and said that we should change it. And they did. But remember earlier in this conversation, I pointed out how Spock was originally back on the Enterprise because he had a bad appendix. All right. So later in that script, Spock beams down to the planet. So, of course, he gets captured. So in the scene where Kirk has to fight Spock in the earlier version, Spock had Kirk. He said to Kirk, "Stab me in the heart. That's where my appendix is," because no one on the planet knew that the Vulcan heart is actually lower in the body. And since Spock was having a bad appendix anyway, he basically said to Kirk, "Stab me in the appendix. I had to have it taken out anyway." You know what I mean? Anyway, that was an earlier sort of development from one of the earlier scripts.
And this version is better. Although, let me warn you ahead of time, this is the scene that I have great problems with.
Oh, interesting.
Well, let's talk about those problems.
Well, tell me when we get there, and we'll. So, and then we have Flavius and another gladiator come in, and I love that there is, of course, an applause track, because we're faking that there's a crowd here. And you did a great push-in on Flavius as he realizes the people he has to fight are Spock and McCoy.
Let me add that the other gladiator was Max Clevin, who was a stuntman that I had worked with in New York on Naked City.
Oh, he played Achilles, the other gladiator.
Yes.
Yeah, see? The way to go. I love it.
And it's time for the fight to begin.
Begin. The master of the games.
Yes.
Who says, we'll do a special on you.
Gene Roddenberry wrote that.
Oh, he did. He does. Jack Perkins plays the master of the games. So there was a scene shot, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because it led to one of the all-time great bloopers on the that old blooper reel. So Jack Perkins, in the script, his line was, "If they don't move out on cue, skewer them." But when it came to say the line, Jack Perkins said, "If they don't move out on cue, screw them." And Shatner busted up laughing, and it's one of the great bloopers on the blooper reel. Yes. But and actually, when they were watching the dailies, Roddenberry saw that Jack Perkins said "screw them," and I think he said to make sure that the actors really enunciate their dialogue.
So the fight starts, and McCoy's up against Flavius, who's taking it real easy on him because he's clearly not much of a fighter. Spock is easily defending himself against this other guy, and I was curious, did Nimoy have fencing training or sword training? Because he moves really well. Yeah, he looks really good.
I tell you, I'm well able to defeat you. Fight, barbarian!
And Merrick turns to Kirk and says,
"Most of my men went the same way." I hoped I would feel it less with yours.
Which means that, I mean, he did have to watch a lot of people, many of whom were probably his friends, die in the arena.
This is where we see Merrick start to regret everything that he has done, because he is seeing two of Kirk's men fighting, and he realizes that he was wrong, and he admires and respects Kirk for holding his ground, and he is also jealous because Kirk is the man that Merrick could never be.
I think that's true, except maybe tone it down a little bit. Not quite that strong. I don't give him quite that much credit.
Sure.
But he's aware, but I'm not sure that, I just don't feel that he would go as far as, oh, I'm so sorry.
Well,
Right.
and I think,
For sure.
I think there's a progression. Like, I think that this is the first moment of weakness. You know, the first chink in the armor or the defensiveness that he's created is happening right now. But it's going to go further as it goes along. And then we get to this moment, Scott, that you mentioned where Flavius is taking it easy on McCoy. He gets whipped, turns around angry, and we hear,
"You bring this network's ratings down, Flavius, and we'll do a special on you."
I love that line. I think that is a brilliant line because it creates this whole idea of like, well, wait, what happens in a special? Like, why would Flavius not want that? It's obviously terrible, you know, and I love that it's ratings. That is what we're talking about. That's what's important.
It feels like a Roddenberry line.
Oh, absolutely. That's the one that made the show the next to the last show of the season and no reruns. It could have been that line.
And then Kirk asks a key question.
Spock should finish his man off first. Will he be able to help? We believe men should fight their own battles.
And that's a very important line.
The Romans have always been the strongest. And they've had practice for over 2,000 years in enslaving men, using them, killing them.
Quite true, Captain Kirk. The games have always strengthened us. Death becomes a familiar pattern. We don't fear it as you do.
And those are lines that I think it's overwritten. My problem with the scene is the scene should be Kirk's concern for the two men in the battle. The whole thing is the battle. And there's much talk up there that gets in the way. And I've always felt that I had done something wrong, that the battle scenes weren't strong enough. And I realize now they're pretty strong if you just stay down with the battle and mainly go up into to Kirk for Kirk's concern and the proconsuls watching him. And you don't need the words, let the action do it.
I couldn't agree more. I think all the sword fighting stuff is good. It's totally well shot, and I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
I think these lines you point out are key because these are like expository lines about Rome and the strength of Rome and why. Who cares? I mean, one of the questions I'd always ask my film students is what is the scene about? And it's a question that frequently they would look at me like, I don't understand the question, which is
that's the basics.
Yeah. And it's that this scene is about Kirk having to figure out what he's going to do. Is there a way for me to save them? How am I going to respond to this? It's all about that's where the emotion of the scene is. It's certainly not about Roman history. That's not what it's about.
Yeah, but even beyond that, it's not really what is Kirk going to do, because Kirk is defenseless. There's nothing he can do. He just is having to sit here and worry that his two friends are going to be killed.
There's more booze, and Flavius is getting whipped, and I love that he yells at McCoy.
At least defend yourself.
I am defending myself.
Like that, you fool. Hold your weapon higher.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah, he's so great. I am defending myself.
and Flavius gives him some instruction mid-fight.
Admit it, you find these games frightening, revolting.
And then you see Kirk put it on.
That I wish wasn't there.
Why?
Because it's about Kirk's concern for the man, for the guys out there, not Kirk putting on a show of how strong I am. I mean, it's not about, this scene is not about Kirk, except as he is aware of his people. This
I see what
bothered me all these years. Because I really thought that the episode itself was a failure because it doesn't have the climax that I'll tell you when we get to it.
Oh, okay.
That it needs.
Let me ask this question, and maybe it's a tough question to answer, but film is always about showing things and about actions.
Absolutely.
What would you have Kirk do? Is there something you would have him do to show that concern in a way that we do, other than him just watching and reacting?
If you just cut to his face and just his facial reaction should be doing it.
Okay.
Well, you actually do see a reaction because Kirk,
it's there. We just don't need all this other word, this other stuff where he then is pretending that it doesn't matter.
Right.
You're taking the strength out of the scene by Kirk's doing what he does in reaction to showing that he doesn't care.
Like Steve, what's the line that Kirk says? He goes, I've seen things that
I've seen forms of entertainment that make this look like a folk dance.
Lose it.
Okay, we're going to reshoot it.
And you'd lose. I've had to select other men to die before so that others could be saved. You'd cut that too.
Say it again.
I've had to select other men to die before so that others could be saved.
That line could survive, but I'm not.
You know what? What's happening, I think that's hard is that because what I think they're trying to do is set up the contrast with Merrick.
You're a clever liar, Captain Kirk. Merik was a spaceship captain. I've observed him thoroughly. Your species has no such strength.
That's not what the scene is about. The scene is about, it's Spock and Doc being
Spock and Doc.
Danger of losing their lives and Kirk having to sit and watch it.
What I think they're doing is that they're trying to do what Scott was talking about before, which is advance the Merrick story of what are the pieces that make Merrick eventually he's going to turn, because we have this.
And that's not important at this point, really, is it?
I don't know, because the next line is one that I think both Scott and I have always focused on as a really important line in Star Trek, which is
he commands not just a spaceship, proconsul, but a starship, a very special vessel and crew. I tried for such command.
I think that's a key line.
Merrick is a secondary character. That's just my feeling.
I completely understand, but at the same time, what makes that line work so well, what makes it such an important line, is that it's establishing that Merrick is never going to be the man that Kirk is. He's never going to be the commander that Kirk is. He's never going to command a starship. He just didn't have it in him to do that. And he admired Kirk for his abilities, but at the same time, he realized his own shortcomings through the process. And that's one of the things that makes Merrick turn at that key moment in Act 4, which we'll get to.
That also happens in the scene when the proconsul, as we'll get to it, comes to Kirk after he's had the evening with the slave girl.
Right.
And when proconsul sends Merrick out of the room because there's no reason for you to stay here and watch real men talk.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's there.
So I know
because I've got an ending that I wish
I can't wait.
I could have shot for the scene.
So I know we got to move on, and I'll say this really, really quick. But the thing I always think about when I'm writing is I frequently am going, well, how do I have my cake and eat it too? I want to have this thing and I want to have this thing, and they kind of contradict. And how can I figure out how to write it to have them both? Is that I love this Mericus line about spaceships and starships. But I also 100% agree with you, Ralph, of where the scene is focused isn't quite right. So I'm going like, well, how, if I were to rewrite the scene, which I'll think about later, how would I figure out how to make both of those things work better?
But if you have to lose that line, let's keep going, because I want to add something.
It's quite a long fight. And Spock is basically, he could end this fight at any moment.
He's holding back.
And the cuts are quicker. And then there comes the spot, McCoy falls.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when it cut to a shot of Flavius standing over him. Now there's no reason not to kill him.
Mm.
Then you cut to the master, who takes the whip, throws the whip out at him and says, kill him.
Mm.
And then Spock goes into action.
Well, they do get this beat that that totally works. They do get this beat that I do like, which is the guy Spock's fighting insults him, calls him a painted ear freak. And McCoy goes, "You tell him, Buster, all the completely ridiculous, illogical questions I ever heard in my life." He's basically just trying to get Spock pissed off.
Well, right away, as soon as Spock stops holding back, he knocks out, Achilles, gives Flavius the neck pinch.
Right.
And there are huge boos because this breaks the rules.
But to build up that moment where McCoy falls, where Flavius is there, I'm ready to kill him. He's being urged to kill him. You've got a climax to the scene. The way it is right now, there's no climax. It just sort of,
Yep. Yep.
And
I totally see that.
Needs a climax.
Clear foul, Proconsul. Your decision?
Your opinion, Merrick. After all, they're like yourself.
This is clearly a test because Merrick should decide to have them killed. And he totally can't do it.
It's your decision, Proconsul.
Your opinion, Captain Kirk. You'd like me to kill them now? An easy death? Then you'd gladly accept whatever happens to you.
And he doesn't answer?
Take them back to their cage.
Well, it won't go that easily for them, Captain. Or for you.
So then they take Kirk out under machine guns, and that is the end of Act 3.
Wow, that was a great act.
It's Act 4, and Kirk is shown into this room, and I love, again, Ralph, you did storytelling within the shot, which is in the foreground. We have the fruit and the wine, which tells us that this is not, we're taking into a very much more luxurious space. It's not going to be a torture scene like we might expect.
Keyword being not like we might expect.
and you always do this thing, Ralph, that I like a lot, which is that you're moving the camera that creates an opening, a space for a new character to move into. And there enters Drusilla.
Yes.
Drusilla, played by Lois Jewell, whose only other TV role was The Flying Nun. And that was it.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, she was a model, but not much of an actress.
And she's
true. Although she did okay.
Yeah, she's very good.
I have read that she too, like Jill Ireland, once she was cast, was concerned about the wardrobe.
Oh, is that right?
Jill, I've read, was concerned, when she was cast in Paradise, because she had seen, I think, what her little girl's made of.
Oh, yeah, sure. Sherry Jackson.
And then when she came there, and Bill, of course, had a great costume for her.
Yep.
And Lois I've read, was also concerned, and also was concerned because of the love scene afterward, for how it might go. And she said that when she saw it, she relaxed and she liked what she saw.
I know that she felt like Bill Shatner was a consummate professional, and she really liked working with him.
Yes.
Yeah, great.
But
that's great to hear.
Into it, she wasn't sure.
I'm Proconsul slave Drusilla, although for this evening I was told I am your slave. Command me.
And now we get pretty clearly what this scene is kind of about.
Absolutely.
And Kirk's first reaction is, this is a trick.
It won't work.
And then he yells to the proconsul, thinking that he's being watched or observed.
Which he probably was.
You hear that, Proconsul? It won't work.
And then she touches his shoulder and he turns around and she says,
We're alone. Please believe me. I've never lied to one who owns me.
The 21st century Steve has issues with this scene. The 12-year-old Steve had none.
Yeah, I feel the same way. The 21st century Scott has issues with the scene. I'd never thought about it much other than thinking it was a pretty cool scene when I was a kid. Always a pretty hot scene. But I mean, I don't know if this scene is necessary at all. Especially if with the way it contradicts Kirk's character, that he's resisting the Romans in every single way, but he gives in to a pretty woman just to have sex with her, just because why not?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And it's a Gene Roddenberry scene.
It doesn't surprise me. Yeah, it's a weird thing, because I think clearly the intention of the scene is that she is completely 100% willing. It's totally fine with her. She's probably attracted to Kirk, and this is not a big deal. That is and
I tried to keep it not a big deal, because as soon as they kissed, the camera went up to the lamp, and then came back down, and it did provide one of the funny lines later.
It does, absolutely.
When he comes back, and when we get to it, I'll tell you the line.
Yeah, I know the line.
That's what I'm thinking of.
Yep.
So when we started, Scott, and you asked me what I thought about this episode, and I said there is one scene that is, I think, one of the great scenes in Star Trek, we're there.
The sales scene. Oh, it's the great scene.
Oh my God, yes.
And this is Gene Kuhn.
And we're in the dungeon, and Spock is in the cell, and he has got his hands on the bars, and it's very clear he's testing the strength. He plays with the lock. McCoy is sitting there in the background. Spock is growing increasingly frustrated, obviously. And McCoy says,
"Angry, Mr. Spock, or frustrated, perhaps?" "Such emotions are foreign to me, Doctor. I'm merely testing the strength of the door." "For the 15th time."
This scene is, like you said, Steve, it's one of the great scenes in all of Star Trek.
I agree.
Now, Ralph, when you were filming this scene, what was it like with Leonard Nimoy and DeForest Kelley? Do you remember how many takes you had to do?
Probably one take for each setup.
Amazing. Oh
no, because they knew what they were ready to play it, and the way I'd staged it was very comfortable for them. And a lot of it is staged in a master.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't get into close-ups until they're back in that final
in the
position.
corner. Yeah,
the rest of it is just in one shot. One setup.
Steve, what is it about the scene that has stuck out at you all this time?
I think there's so much truth and subtext about their characters, about their relationships. And I think in so many ways, each one sees into the other in lots of ways, and then doesn't see into the other in lots of ways. There's so much truth here. Like, just starting with, is Spock frustrated and angry? I think the answer is 100% yes. McCoy is totally right about that. And then McCoy is going to do something, and it's well set up in the episode. That's part of the other thing that makes it work, is we've had them in conflict multiple times in the episode. We have Kirk's line saying, "Are they enemies? I don't know. Sometimes I'm not even sure if they know." That's setting up this moment. And then McCoy, in his most, honest way, comes up.
"Spock."
And Spock is ignoring him.
"Spock, I know we've had our disagreements. Maybe they're jokes. I don't know. As Jim says, we're not often sure ourselves sometimes."
And it's very obvious that McCoy is trying to say something heartfelt. Do you think that Spock knows that McCoy is trying to say something heartfelt?
Yes, 100%. I do.
And what he is doing in this moment is going, I can't deal with this emotion right now.
Correct. Yes.
What I'm trying to say is, Doctor, I'm seeking a means of escape. Will you please be brief?
Up to this point, before the direction this conversation takes, one of the things that I've always liked to do when I'm able to do it, Steve and Ralph, during Enterprise incidents, is mirror a scene from the original series to something that happens in one of the movies. So this moment here, the scene where McCoy is basically saying, "Spock, I want to thank you for saving my life," reminded me of the scene in Star Trek 3 when they are on the Klingon bird of prey on their way back to Earth, before all the stuff happens with the probe and they have to go back in time. And McCoy is trying to have a tender, personal moment with Spock, where he basically is saying, "I'm glad that your Katra is back where it belongs in you." And he says, "Are you busy?" And he goes, "Uhura is busy. I am monitoring." He's basically having, in Star Trek 3 at that moment, though not for as intense as it's about to get in Bread and Circuses, he's having the same moment. McCoy goes up to him with his guard down, wants to just share a personal moment with Spock. And Spock is like basically saying, "I don't have time for this right now." And that's exactly what happened in Bread and Circuses.
I hate to say, too, when someone comes to you emotionally somewhat open, I think McCoy is showing courage. That's not that easy to do necessarily. And Spock's way of shutting him down is horrible.
Well, what I'm trying to say is you saved my life in the arena. Yes, that's quite true. I'm trying to thank you, you pointed-eared hobgoblin.
And of course, Spock knows that thank you and you're welcome and what this is, but he is too afraid, I believe, to deal with these emotions that he's feeling right now. And so instead, he takes the superior, condescending, insulting position and says,
"Oh, yes, you humans have that emotional need to express gratitude. You're welcome, I believe, is the correct response."
It is so cold and so unfeeling. And it's all covering, in my opinion, insecurity, which is what we're going to get to.
However, Doctor, you must remember that I'm entirely motivated by logic.
Not true.
The loss of our ship's surgeon, whatever I may think of his relative skill, would mean a reduction in the efficiency of the Enterprise.
I want to ask another question. Does Spock think poorly of McCoy's skills as a surgeon?
Absolutely not.
No, he thinks he's great.
He thinks he's the best. He's basically saying, I saved you because you're the best chief surgeon, and not having you on the Enterprise would be bad.
But he's making a joke like he doesn't think that, because he says, whatever I may think of his relative skill, but of course he does think that. And
it's
then
a backhanded compliment in his Vulcan way of saying it.
And then he's in this corner sitting, and McCoy enters the frame and turns him and puts him sort of against the wall. Beautifully staged, Ralph, on your part, because it's intense. I think McCoy comes at him with a lot of intensity and physical almost dominance in this moment.
There's no why you're not afraid to die, Spock. You're more afraid of living. Each day you stay alive is just one more day you might slip and let your human half peek out.
Do you think this is true so far?
Yes, I do. I think that McCoy really has Spock figured out in a way that he never has before, and that is because of all the time that they have served together.
And I think McCoy has thought this thought for a long time, but not voiced it. And the moment that Nimoy turns away, there's a little half a smile on DeForest Kelly's face, because I think he knows, like, oh yeah, I got it.
That's it, isn't it? And security. Why, you wouldn't know what to do with a genuine, warm, decent feeling.
There's a lot to say about this moment. There's a reaction. He turns back to McCoy and says,
"Really, Doctor?"
What do you think's going on here?
Everything you've talked about, but all pushed down.
Yes.
Very quiet.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And slow, and without any push. It's just a quiet, very quiet scene, and very close. I mean, once they get into the corner, I mean, the shots are really right in on them, so they really don't have to. It's all in their faces.
Yeah.
But you shot them through the bars. You didn't go on the other side of the bars and just shoot the close-ups up.
Well,
I shot them through the bars.
One shot inside of the bar when I was across McCoy to Spock at the wall. But otherwise, I was outside with the bars between, which it just looked better.
It does look good. It looks great.
See, it's a very intense but controlled scene.
Yes, yeah.
All those emotions you're talking about, but they're
underneath,
tempered down.
Yeah, they're in the subtext,
which is the best way to do drama.
Absolutely, of course it is, Ralph.
So up to this point, I asked, is McCoy right? His last line, why you wouldn't know what to do with a genuine, warm, decent feeling. Is McCoy right there?
No, I don't. I don't think that he's right at all. Spock knows what to do with the feeling. He knows how to do it. Spock knows how to handle a warm feeling.
So I've always loved this scene. I've always thought it was great. This last time watching it got even deeper to me because I feel like I finally got it, which I don't think I got before, which is the moment of Spock turning back and saying, "Really, Doctor," is in response to this line, you wouldn't know what to do with a genuine, warm, decent feeling. The scene started with Spock being frustrated and McCoy seeing that he was frustrated and Spock denying that he was having those emotions. The reason he is frustrated is because he's having a warm, decent feeling. His love for Kirk is what's frustrating him right now. And so McCoy, who was right totally up to this point and knew he was frustrated, didn't understand what was really going on a fundamental level until he turns back and says, "Really, Doctor," because not only does Spock know that that's the feeling he's having, but he knows that deep down McCoy understood the feeling he was having, which is the purpose of the whole conversation, if that makes any sense. So he turns back and says, "Really," he's like, "Dude, you know I'm frustrated. You know I'm having this feeling right now." And there's this pause, and McCoy understands all of everything I just said that took me 40 years of watching this episode to fully get, and says,
I know. I'm worried about Jim, too.
Great scene, amazing scene. That scene just elevates what I think is already a stellar episode, and one that is often overlooked for, I don't know why.
Oh, absolutely. I agree.
And of course, we go from this moment of his two best friends in the world really, really worried about him, because what do they think might be happening to Kirk right now?
Well, they think he's getting tortured,
killed, horrible, horrible things,
and that's not what's happening.
And then
McCoy says, "I know, I'm worried about him too."
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we cut to Kirk with his hand on the wine with the Drusilla. He's eating. The wine is excellent. The drink is excellent.
I've been in some strange worlds, strange customs. Perhaps this is considered torture here.
Torture? I do not understand. I do not wish to see you tortured in any way.
And she kisses him. And I again will say, I think the intention of this scene is that she's 100% willing. This is consensual. She is attracted to Kirk. I think that's the way the scene is done. But today, and thinking about it, she is a slave who has been ordered to have sex with this guy. Yeah. There is no consent here. And that looking at it from today's perspective, Kirk should not sleep with her.
Right. And also, for in addition to it being the fact that she is a slave and this is not consensual, the other reason Kirk shouldn't sleep with her is that he has stood his ground in every other way during this episode. And it's a flaw in his character that he could be so swayed by a pretty face and give in that way.
Then again, I mean, that was Roddenberry.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the feature film he did when he did his first feature, I can't remember the name of it, but it was totally a sex film.
You go all the way back to the Orion sex slave. I mean, this is clearly in Roddenberry, this particular thing.
Yeah.
But the camera tilts up to the lamp, and anytime people are kissing and we tilt up to something, I think we have an implication of what happened next. And then there's a dissolve, and of course we dissolve to the lamp, and the light is out, showing the passage of time. And Kirk is asleep, and we hear Captain, and he wakes up, and there's the proconsul.
Talk about a rude awakening.
It's a good thing he pulled his pants back on, is what I was thinking.
Should we have our little talk now?
So far on this planet, we've kept you rather busy. I don't wonder you slept through the afternoon.
Which, by the way, I think Kirk would have woken up. His men are in prison. He's about to get killed. I don't think he would lazily sleep the day away.
No, of course not.
And we hear a little plant that a communicator has gone missing. Merrick enters and searches Kirk for this communicator, doesn't find it.
That's because he has it.
I am sorry I was detained. I trust that there was nothing further you required.
Nothing except perhaps an explanation.
Because you're a man, I owe you that. You must die shortly, and because you are a man.
And then he looks at Merrick, and this is, Ralph, what you were talking about before.
It's the line.
Would you leave us, Merrick? The thoughts of one man to another cannot possibly interest you.
Those lines that the proconsul says to Merrick is the straw that broke the camel's back for Merrick. Sure. And that is what saved the lives of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy.
Mm-hmm. So Merrick exits, and he says,
because you are a man, I gave you some last hours as a man.
Which is a line I always, as a kid, as a 12-year-old boy, this seemed like a great thing.
Unfortunately, we must demonstrate that defiance is intolerable.
Scott, what episode did that remind you of?
Defiance is intolerable.
Like an empire saying that they can't let anyone openly defy them.
Oh, absolutely. Mirror, mirror.
It's mirror, mirror. This Roman world is very similar to mirror, mirror.
It's the empire. Both of them are the empire. Yep.
But I've learned to respect you. I promise you will die easily, quickly.
I thank you. And my friends.
When that time comes, the same, of course.
It's time to head off to the arena, and I love that he says,
oh, we've preempted 15 minutes on the early show for you, in full color. We guarantee you a splendid audience.
I have a question. When Kirk is being led away from the proconsul, what do you think Kirk is thinking at this point? Do you think that he feels like he's a goner, that this is it for him and for Spock and McCoy?
Has to be. He
has not heard from Scotty since that last, quick exchange. cavalry has come over the hill, especially because he told them not to through Code Green. So, like, what do you think that Kirk is thinking? Like, well, I guess this is it.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to tell you two entirely separate and contradictory thoughts. I think the way this episode is constructed, yes, he is thinking, oh, maybe this is it. But I think from what we know about Kirk's character, can't possibly be true.
I agree.
Is that Kirk's character how many times has he been literally about to be killed in one way or another that he is still looking for some way to get out of it?
Oh, absolutely.
And as we know, Kirk doesn't believe in a no-win scenario.
We're back up at the Enterprise where we hear that all banks are ready to disrupt the power on the planet's surface. By the way, one thing that they didn't do a lot of time on, and you only have so much time in this episode, is they can watch TV on the Enterprise. So they could have been watching a whole bunch of these things that are happening to find out what's going on.
That's a good point.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before tonight's first heat, a simple execution. But stay tuned to this channel. There's a lot of excitement coming your way.
And Kirk is there, and we hear, make it a quick, simple thrust.
Don't move. You'll only die harder.
He's so great. That guy is so great. Jack Perkins.
In comes Flavius, who I think we've kind of forgotten about. And so he comes out of nowhere and goes,
Brothers, if you want just like me.
And the proconsul makes a gesture, and they grab those machine guns, and Flavius gets killed.
Flavius, a final act of heroism.
Mm-hmm.
He has lived his last moments by his own philosophy, one that Kirk shares, where man must fight to live.
And Kirk takes that moment to grab the executioner, uses him as a human shield, kills one guy with a sword, kicks another, and at this moment on the Enterprise, we hear now Mr. Chekhov activate, and they knock all the power out, and everything goes dark, and Kirk gets a chance to escape.
We're getting to the next scene with Kirk coming to the cell. And the day before, there was going to be a rewrite on that scene. Gene Roddenberry was rewriting it, and it was late in the day. And so he promised me, he said, I don't have the scene now, but I will write it tonight. I will have it at the studio at 6:00 tomorrow morning. And so I said, okay. And so I was there at 6:00, and it was there just like he had promised. I've done other promises like that where they weren't there, but it was there. And so I had from 6:00 until 7:30 to work on the scene. And it was going to be the big finale. And Ted Cassidy came roaming into the set. And I've never known exactly where he came from. I always figured he came from Mission Impossible because it was on the next door stage.
I could tell you where he came from, Ralph, because this moment is also on the blooper reel. Ted Cassidy.
I staged that scene.
Oh, you staged it?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, that is hilarious.
Well, but that's it. That's why I was saying I didn't know where he was coming from, and I just assumed he might come from Mission Impossible, which was right next door.
He was actually filming The New Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. That's where he was.
Okay, well, so he was on the lot, but because he had done Star Trek, he was around there. And when I saw him, and so I had that all planned out. Everybody knew except Bill.
You got to explain. You got to explain what it was.
The camera crew knew they were going to do.
What happened was it was the scene where Kirk goes back to the cell to free Spock and McCoy, and Ted Cassidy comes out of nowhere, runs onto the set, picks up William Shatner, and carries him off the set.
All the way back to exactly where he had come in from. So it was a long carry. Yeah. No, that was all planned.
It's hilarious. It's in the blooper reel, and it's hilarious. It's one of the great moments.
I've seen it on. Unfortunately, the film on the blooper reel is kind of fading. I wish they'd do a remake, restore it.
Yeah, absolutely. But Kirk runs into the dungeon. There is no Ted Cassidy. He fires his weapon at the lock and breaks it. McCoy and Spock come out, and very concerned, they say,
"What happened, Jim? What did they do to you, Captain?"
They threw me a few curves. No time to explain.
And then the guards show up in both directions.
We're in each other's line of fire.
And he turns to Merrick again, cutting him down one more time, and says,
"I pity you, Captain Merik, but at least watch and see how men die. Swords only!"
He calls him Captain Merrick, not Mericus. He calls him Captain Merrick as if to say, you are not a Roman. You never were. You never will be. And you're right. Wow. That's the ultimate takedown. And that's the moment of truth.
And we're in the midst of a fight scene, and our guys are doing pretty well. Spock gets a sword. They're sort of backing up into a defensible position in the cell. And the camera pushes in on Merrick, who has that communicator.
Starship, lock in on this. 3 to beat.
And as he's saying the word up, Proconsul stabs him in the back. And it's a violent scene for a show that was filmed in 1967. And then he pulls the knife out. There's blood on the knife. And Merrick, it's such a great scene. He stumbles. And as he tosses the communicator into the cell, he is smiling as if to say, this is all I got. This is all I have to give. It's such a great moment.
I think he finally passed the test that he failed at Starfleet Academy. Right. I think this is it. And I'm wondering, Ralph, did you at any moment, were you thinking about Bridge on the River Kwai when you filmed this last moment? Because that's what it's always made. It's always made me think of Alec Guinness stumbling towards the plunger to blow up the bridge at the end of Kwai.
When I'm doing a scene, I'm just thinking about the scene to make it real.
So what happens is, the communicator is into the cell, and you hear Scotty say, ready to beam up. Just as Kirk, Spock, and McCoy begin to dematerialize, the Roman guards are shooting their guns, and of course the bullets are going right through the transporter beam. I don't care how many times you've seen Bread and Circuses. This is such a great nick of time, edge of your seat, nail biter that is still effective time and time again, and it is such a well-directed scene, Ralph. I have always loved this scene. It is such a rousing, exciting moment. So to be able to tell you that you just staged and shot that scene brilliantly, and just when they're done beaming up, you see the Roman guards and you see that the proconsul is looking, because even though he knows about Merrick and Kirk and where they're from, odds are he has never seen really the technology of the 23rd century in action until this moment. And the way he's twirling the bloody knife around in his hand, even he was impressed.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think it's a great scene too. I also love that we had the earlier line of, it would be a shame to beam up a bullet-ridden corpse, which they're a second away from beaming up 3 bullet. Those guys fired a little bit earlier. The other thing is watching the proconsul. It looks to me like the actor is startled by the sound of the machine guns, not the actor is acting like he's startled by the sound of the machine guns.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, you see. I think Logan Ramsey. It's
like a real joke.
Well, that's an actor using that for himself.
Now, here's the other thing about this emergency beam up in the nick of time, saving the lives of the landing party, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. Here is an episode where Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, the Enterprise crew, accomplished nothing. They didn't change the society. They didn't change the direction. They didn't stop a war. They didn't stop the gladiatorial games from happening. They didn't change the fact that there is slavery on this planet. The goal was to get out and escape. And that is exactly what happened. Yep. And that is all that happened. They did not violate the Prime Directive, not even a little bit. And earlier in the episode, when Merrick says that some of his men are dead, the ones who were able to survive adapted, what happened to them? Are they happy on the planet? There was no effort to save the survivors of the SS Beagle. The goal, this is really the only episode where nothing was really accomplished. They just got out of there.
They got away.
They just got away with their lives.
And it's such again, the build up to that moment with the Scotty shorting out the power and, Kirk getting out of the arena in a split second as the guards are firing on him. And then the fight in the cell and then the emergency beam up and the death of Merrick. It's one of the great directed scenes in Star Trek. And it's just something that I think often gets overlooked.
And isn't it a shame that the network that really wanted action shows, and they had an action show, and because of their own thin skins, they didn't utilize it.
I mean, this is an action show. This is exactly what they wanted. This is exactly what Stan Robertson at NBC, this is exactly what he wanted. And, the pacing of this episode, all the ideas, I mean, certainly the satire of TV, maybe they didn't dig that, obviously, but everything else about it, so many great moments, the acting, the performances, the direction, obviously the cinematography, as we always talk about.
Even the track music.
They did a great job with using track music and making it seem like it was scored for this episode. Absolutely.
So we're back on the bridge. Scotty gets a commendation for basically saving the day. Spock and McCoy enter, and we start talking about sun worship.
It seems illogical for a sun worshiper to develop a philosophy of total brotherhood. Sun worship is usually a primitive superstition religion.
And then we hear Uhura, who comes in and says,
I'm afraid you have it all wrong, Mr. Spock, all of you. I've been monitoring some of their old-style radio waves. The Empire spokesman trying to ridicule their religion. But he couldn't.
Well, don't you understand? It's not the sun up in the sky. It's the Son of God.
Wow. What a great moment. Yeah. And again, no matter how many times, yes, brilliant moment. So this scene, which was filmed the same day that you filmed the teaser, like to shoot the first part of the episode and the last part of the episode, that's, it's still hard to wrap my head around that, but that's
how they make movies.
Yeah, that's how they do it. Sure, for sure.
So Ralph, was there ever any discussion on the set about this idea? Like, no, it was just because I think this is a brilliant piece of writing. I think the moment is great. I always have loved it, and I have real problems with it philosophically. Not in terms of an episode of television. I think it's totally great. In terms of Star Trek, because what it implies is that, particularly her line, things like her saying he tried to ridicule it, but he couldn't. This implies that Christianity is the right religion. That is what the implication of this moment is. And as a Jewish kid growing up, and then as an atheist, I have a problem with that in terms of Star Trek. I really do.
But there again, you've got Shatner and Nimoy.
Yep.
Me. I mean, the Jewish triad.
Yeah.
And what's interesting too is then what happens next.
Caesar and Christ, they had them both. And the word is spreading only now.
Philosophy of total love and total brotherhood. It will replace their imperial Rome, but it will happen in their 20th century.
Well, I think about, what was Christianity for the 1,000 years after Rome, or the next 1,000 years for that matter?
Wouldn't it be something to watch, to be a part of? To see it happen all over again.
And there's these big smiles. And what's weird to me is the implication is like, yeah, Christianity was totally a philosophy of total love and brotherhood. And that's just how it went. There was no problems with it at all. And again, I'm not trying to criticize Christians or the Christian faith in any way whatsoever. In fact, I will say that for me personally, Jesus is one of my heroes. I know that sounds strange to say from a Jewish atheist, but philosophically, I am 100% aligned with the stuff that he said. But in terms of, there's a lot of stuff that happened historically that ain't so good. And the fact that in the 23rd century, they're looking at it like, hey, this is all awesome, or just this is the truth, is something that rubs me the wrong way.
I have a question, and it's based on questions that have been asked of me. And that is, in the writing, how did this script come into being? I mean, people have pointed out to me that it is a well-known fact how anti-religion Roddenberry is.
Right.
Somebody suggested, well, one of the producers was Jewish. I still don't know about Kuhn. His father was a Nazi, so I don't know whether he was Jewish. How about Knugel?
What about Bob Justman?
Well, I think he was Jewish, wasn't he?
Yes.
The script started with, and I didn't know this, John Knubel.
John Knubel. Right. He was a native of American Samoa. He was born in the South Pacific.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
How did this script come into being?
Here's the thing. So John Knubel wrote the treatment, and then Gene Kuhn picked it up, wrote 3 drafts, and then Roddenberry wrote the last 2 versions and then did script revisions throughout the production of the episode. So my impression was that Roddenberry wrote the tag. In terms of, look, the way that history has played out for these last 2,100 years, that's now happening in 20th century Rome, and that's the way it's going to play out. I never thought that they were saying that, Christianity was the favored religion. I mean, like McCoy said, we have many beliefs. I felt like they were reveling in the opportunity to experience this one part of many religions play out versus favoring one moment over every other. I never looked at it as any kind of favoritism in any way. I was never offended by it.
I wasn't offended by it at all.
I'm not offended by it. That's not, yeah. Offended would be much, much stronger a word than how I feel. No, what I feel is it's the wrong choice for Star Trek. That's what I feel. I'm not offended by it in any way. I think it's between this and we find the one God sufficient. Those are two statements, this episode, two statements that seem to reinforce a particular perspective. But it's funny. To me, this always felt like this is where it had to be in the mid-'60s. You know what I mean? Like, you couldn't come up and say a entirely secular, non-religious message. That wasn't where, and even today, this would be a controversial thing.
Well, actually, in terms of Roddenberry, the other reason why I feel like this last part of the episode was written by Roddenberry, when Star Trek was gaining popularity, like big time popularity throughout the 70s, and Paramount went back and forth with, are we going to bring Star Trek back as a TV series again, or are we going to make a movie? One of the story developments that they were exploring for a feature film was that the Enterprise goes in search of God. I mean, that's right. That's the real basic plot, is that they were going in search of God. And then ultimately it went in the direction of Star Trek, the motion picture, where it was spiritual in the sense that V'Ger was looking for its creator. And eventually they did go looking for God in Star Trek V, which, while not a great movie, has its merits, although not many people would agree with that. So with regards to the way that Bread and Circuses came to its conclusion, that I feel like was very much Roddenberry's pen. And while Roddenberry has also been seen as agnostic in some ways, or an atheist, he did have a spiritual side in which he wanted the Enterprise to go in search of God. And I think this is the closest they really came to it, because, ultimately in Star Trek V, what they saw was not God. But in terms of like what people had to say about Bread and Circuses, we have the director of the episode with us right now. And I would love to hear what you have to say about Bread and Circuses, Ralph Senensky.
Well, it's always been on my lesser list, mainly because of the gladiator scene. And ever since I started with you and have been infected with deep divitis, I've given you my interpretation of what I wish we could have done, of what I would think it should have been in the gladiator scene. And outside of that, I mean, as I've watched it, I'm proud of it. I'm proud of the series, of the episode.
I'm really glad to hear you say that, because like while I was watching it, just obviously to prepare for this, Ralph, I know how much you cherish your experiences on This Side of Paradise and Metamorphosis, as you should. I mean, those are very, very special episodes. But while I was rewatching Bread and Circuses, I really had a reaction of like, wait a minute, this is actually really, really good. Much better than I ever really gave it credit for. I've always enjoyed it, but I really think that there is a lot to love and a lot to admire about Bread and Circuses. And it's not an episode that gets talked about very much. So I would love to hear what the fans think about Bread and Circuses. Let us know on our Facebook page where you kind of rank Bread and Circuses, how you feel about Bread and Circuses after our deep dive conversation. Maybe it's gone up in your assessment, but Steve, I would love to hear what you think of Bread and Circuses now after all these years and after this conversation.
So I think it's a totally entertaining episode. And I think what's interesting, Ralph, is that it doesn't have the heartfelt emotional power of the other two episodes that we've talked about with you. But in terms of an adventure, it's actually in a lot of ways a more exciting adventure. It's a lot of fun. It deals with some interesting issues. It has, as we've said, one of what I think is the most important scenes between McCoy and Spock in the history of Star Trek. I think it establishes so much of their characters. And I'm going to say just very quickly, there's an episode that I wish that it was, which is that I wish science fiction is really good at making us look at ourselves. And this, I think, was an opportunity, and maybe the network would never have let it on the air. But the idea of not how are we not like Rome, but is how are we like Rome? What can seeing Rome in the 20th century teach us about us in the 20th century? And I feel like they kind of veered away from that. And I think part of that, the God thing, the son of the God thing, allows us to feel a little bit superior to Rome in the 20th century. And I wish we could have explored that more. That's not a criticism of the episode. This is what Steve would be more interested in.
Well, I want to say on top of that I think that this episode does hold a mirror up to society in the 60s and in the 21st century because of the satire of network television. And especially with reality TV, I think, you know what, that's a lot right there. The fact that you have an episode that has gained relevancy over the last 55 years because of the place that network television has in our everyday lives, especially over these last 2 years when we've watched a lot more of it because we were stuck inside our homes, and because in the last 20 years, because of the escalation of reality TV. I think right there, that alone holds a mirror up to our society. And I think that's something that does get overlooked about the episode. The other thing that I noticed about this episode that I never noticed before, we talked about the transition between Desilu and Paramount. So, in the ending credits, where it shows the image of Baylock at the very, very end of the ending credits, up to and including The Trouble with Tribbles, it would say a Desilu production in association with Norway Corporation. At the end of Bread and Circuses, the ending credit says a Paramount production in association with Norway Corporation. So this was the start of the transition. And I'm guessing, Ralph, that as you came back for Obsession and Return to Tomorrow, that intensified.
And I have one more incident that I'd saved for the end and then almost forgot it. Halfway through on the third or fourth day, Herb Solow, the head of production for Desilu, and John Meredith Lucas came down to the set, and they had an opening suddenly, and they wanted to know if I would do it. And it was not to start prepping a show the minute I finished. It was one after that. And I said, well, I can't because it's the Jewish high holidays.
Mm-hmm.
And Herb Solow said, wait a minute. So he got out a calendar and he started checking, and he said, Rosh Hashanah will fall on, and he pointed out the dates. He said, that'll be during the prep. And that's no problem. You'll just have your prep ready.
Uh-huh.
And then he went on further, and he saw that Yom Kippur was going to fall on Saturday, but Kol Nidre would be on Friday. And he said, that's no problem. John Meredith Lucas is a member of the Directors Guild. He can come in the afternoon whenever you need to leave. And so that was how I ended up doing Obsession.
Oh, okay.
At the time, I was a little confused. I thought, well, that's very strange to have an opening. I mean, yeah, I knew how directors were booked. And it's only later that, and I'm pretty sure, I don't know this for sure, but I'm pretty sure that it occurred because that was when Joe Pevney gave his resignation.
Oh, wow.
And I have a feeling that he was scheduled to do, and maybe you will have some reference to find out if that is true, that he was scheduled to do that show. And Joe Joe Pevney, and I didn't know him as well as I knew Mark Daniels, but Joe had a very close relationship with Gene Kuhn. They had known each other way back. And I had the feeling that a combination that with the new rules that were now coming in because of the new hours being set forth by Doug Kramer, the head of production for Paramount, that could have affected it, and also that maybe just his allegiance to Gene Kuhn, and maybe he was going to leave with him. But anyway, that's that story.
Well, we're looking forward to having you join us again in a few episodes for our deep dive of Obsession. That's your fourth episode. That'll be your fourth podcast of Enterprise Incidents to join us on. And Steve, where can people find you and Enterprise Incidents?
Well, social media is the place for you to go. You can search for us on Facebook. You can look for Enter Incidents on Twitter, Enterprise Incidents on Instagram. Subscribe to the show, please. I think you subscribe at all the places. Apple Podcasts, go to Spotify, subscribe there too. Why not? On YouTube, subscribe there as well. Leave your comments. Back on iTunes, oh, you know what? You forgot to leave a review. Well, I think now it's time for you to type up that 5-star review. And after you've done with that, you can follow me on Twitter at SRMorris, SRMorris1 on Instagram. And if you like movies, you can follow the Cinephiles. And since you obviously like gladiators, why don't you check out Gladiator? We already mentioned it. Winner of the Best Picture, starring Russell Crowe. Scott, how would people find you?
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at MovieMans. Make sure you share Enterprise Incidents with your fellow Star Trek fans, whether they are diehard fans of the original series or just love Star Trek in all of its forms. And just once again, Ralph Senensky, thank you so much for taking this time to join us for the entire duration of our deep dive of Bread and Circuses here on Enterprise Incidents. Now, you have a blog, Ralph.
A website.
Where can people read your website?
Either Google Ralph Cinema Trek or just go to Senensky.com.
Senensky.com certainly is the easier way to go. So we look forward to having you back for Obsession. Meanwhile, the next episode of Enterprise Incidents is going to be a fun one, because just like we got to see some of Spock's backstory in Amok Time, we're going to see a whole lot more of Spock's backstory as we take the journey to Babel. That is next on Enterprise Incidents. Until then, keep going boldly.